Hello, welcome back. Muda, the blind husband here. I got some new hype music for this stream as well. I hope you guys enjoy this. Took a lot of work to get this all going. Google released a new tool called Flow Music. They also released a new tool called Edge Dialogue, I believe, or Flow Dialogue or something. So this one, the music tool, is basically a bunch of like AI songs that are in there, and then you can customize them the way that you like them. I chose this one. There goes the blind husband. Yeah, for more of the YouTube does have a bunch of our videos, and TikTok has like 9,000 followers. And the blind husband Twitch for all the latest live streams and best notifications. Follow at the blind husband. And so either way, that tool does help me create this music that you're hearing, which is pretty cool. And today, what the plan for the entire stream is, we are going to go chapters 1 all the way through chapter 5 for any newcomers. So I don't know where I should be looking. Maybe you can't wait. Look at that. Hello, guys. It hurt my eye. Ow. But either way, yeah, we're going to do the... Sorry, I hope we're going to do the whole story. It might, I don't know how long it's going to take, but I will be monitoring each chat. So if anybody has anything to say at all, I will be responding. I will see you guys after the book, chapters 1 through 5, The Lethal Journey, or just Lethal Journey dash 17. That is what we're calling the working title for this particular novel right now. And I hope you all have a great day. See you on the flip. Let's get it.
Speech on. Live direct describe heading. Contain toggle screen recognition. Voices. Sounds. Punctuation. Sounds. On. Sounds. Easy reader. Active. Easy reader. Active. Play. Steel support beam 30 floors above the previous. A dumb wakes up before the artificial daylight cycle flickers on inside. Previous. Chapter. Lethal journey. Speech off. Chapter 1. A dumb wakes up before the artificial daylight cycle flickers on inside the towering hollowed-out carcass of a long-abandoned industrial arcology on a neglected outer rim trading world. His living space is little more than a cramped box built from rusted freighter plating and mismatched sheet metal clamped onto a massive steel support beam 30 floors above the concrete baseline of the structure. The cold air inside smells of stale ozone, damp concrete, and the heavy burnt oil odor filtering down from upper-level factory vents. Through the gaps in his door frame, the gargantuan vertical squatter city slowly comes alive with a low mechanical groan. Hundreds of improvised shacks cling to the interior walls of the open-air central shaft like rusted barnacles, connected by unsafe suspension walkways and rickety iron ladders. Far below, dense blue fog hangs over the flooded ground floor where scavengers barter for clean water, while high above, bright repulsor lift traffic cuts through the smog beyond the building's shattered glass dome. Adam sits on the edge of his thin sleeping pad and pulls his worn flight jacket over his shoulders to ward off the damp chill. On a low wooden crate he uses as a workbench lies his most prized collection of findings: a tangle of braided droid wiring, a half-charged power cell, and a cracked datapad with a flickering green display that he dragged out of an upper tier recycling chute yesterday. Outside, the muffled noise of street vendors firing up plasma burners mixes with the rhythmic clatter of heavy machinery, signaling that the lower levels are active and ready to be explored. Adam pushes open his heavy corrugated metal door and steps out onto a narrow, rusting catwalk that clings to the sheer inner cliff of the giant arcology. The air hits him immediately, thick with the stench of synthetic cooking oil, burning refuse, and moisture dripping from the miles of tangled pipes overhead. Below him, the massive central shaft drops into a hazy gloom where the faint neon glow of makeshift storefronts bleeds through the gray smog. To get the cracked datapad working, Adam needs to find a functional micro power regulator and a clean data bridge connector. He can either head down the hanging iron ladder to the crowded black market bazaar on level 10 where scrap dealers trade in salvaged tech, or he can climb higher up into the maintenance service tunnels where old automation droids have been abandoned. Adam stands frozen on the narrow, vibrating catwalk outside his door, his fingers tightening instinctively around the cold, cracked edge of the datapad in his pocket. His gaze drops down into the dizzying, gray-tinted abyss of the lower levels where the massive open-air bazaar on level 10 pulses with faint, flickering neon lights. Part of him desperately wants to go down there. The lower market is a chaotic symphony of life, smells, and motion, filled with sizzling street food, colorful merchant stalls, and the steady hum of commerce that makes him feel like he is part of a larger universe. Yet, as the memory of his last trip down there surfaces, his stomach tightens into a hard knot. It had been a disaster. He remembers the sharp, bitter smell of ozone mixing with cheap spice, the rough shove of a bulky transition scrap hauler who nearly knocked him off the walkway, and the cold, dismissive sneer of a Rhodian junk dealer named Pago. Pago had caught Adam trying to pocket a loose micro-diode, grabbed him roughly by the collar, and threatened to feed him to the scrap compactor down in the sub-basement. Adam had barely managed to slip away into the crowd, his heart hammering against his ribs, empty-handed and humiliated. He knows that heading back down there today with 0 credits, no trade goods, and a reputation as a desperate kid who got caught stealing would only make things infinitely worse. The vendors recognize him now. Without money, a kid like him is just a target or a nuisance to be swatted away. That leaves only one option, and the mere thought of it sends a cold shiver down his spine. He has to go upward into the towering, forgotten maintenance service tunnels, a brutal, exhausting climb that will require at least a full hour of hazardous traversing. It means squeezing through tight, grease-slicked access ports, tight-roping across rusted structural I-beams suspended hundreds of feet above the concrete baseline, and navigating around active, humming machinery left behind by corporations that abandoned this sector decades ago. One wrong slip, one loose bolt, or a sudden gust of toxic exhaust from a hidden manifold, and he would plummet into the darkness below. It is a terrifying, high-stakes choice, but it is the only one he has left if he wants to salvage the parts needed to boot up his datapad. As he hesitates, his thoughts drift back to his parents. He pictures them hauling themselves out of their thin sleeping pallets before the synthetic sunrise just like he had, dragging their exhausted bodies toward the upper tier industrial levels where they pull shifts lasting up to 15 hours a day. His father works the heavy plasma welding rigs, coming home with burns on his knuckles and his clothes permanently stained with gray soot, while his mother works the automated textile sorting lines until her eyes are bloodshot and her fingers are swollen. They work themselves nearly to death every single day just to scrape together enough credits for meager nutrient paste and the steep rent demanded by the Arcology's automated landlords. By the time they stagger back to the shack late at night, they are so utterly drained, so hollowed out by exhaustion, that they barely have the energy to speak, let alone spend quality time with him. They look right through him sometimes, their minds consumed by survival. Because of this relentless grind, Adam has essentially been entirely on his own for years. Formal schooling stopped completely right around the time he turned 10 years old. In a vertical hive where everyone is just desperately scraping by to see tomorrow, there are no teachers, no schoolhouses, and no public programs. Education is a luxury reserved for the wealthy elites living thousands of levels higher up, clean and untouched under the real sunlight. Down here, education is learning how to patch a leaking pipe, how to spot a counterfeit power cell, and how to stay invisible when the local enforcers sweep the corridors. He has had to teach himself everything, learning the hard way through trial, error, and close calls. He takes a deep breath, filling his lungs with the damp, stale air of the Arcology, and turns away from the iron ladder leading down to the market. Shifting the strap of his worn jacket, he looks upward toward the dark.
For a 1% drop in factory production, a paranoid dictator just threatened to execute his top officials unless they find a saboteur. To keep her head off the chopping block, one desperate bureaucrat realizes she needs a scapegoat.
The true peak of the manufacturing world, a realm entirely detached from the toxic gray gloom of the lower levels. Piercing the shattered upper dome of the Arcology is a monolithic tower that stretches a full kilometer into the sky above the structure, creating a staggering 2-kilometer vertical gulf between Adam's miserable existence and the pristine heights of the ruling elite. This entire planet is essentially a colossal, hyper-industrialized manufacturing plant, its natural ecosystem long since ruined, its atmosphere completely choked and destroyed by centuries of unchecked heavy processing. Down below, the air is a thick, poisonous soup of industrial smog, chemical runoff, and recycled filth. Only at the very top of the tower, high above the perpetual cloud layer, does the air clear enough to taste fresh, and only there can the privileged few witness the rare, unshielded brilliance of genuine sunlight. Inside the opulent, climate-controlled command spire at the peak of the tower resides the sector governor, a being whose existence is defined by total detachment, immense paranoia, and gluttonous excess. He is a massive, grossly overweight alien with mottled green skin, tipping the scales at a staggering 400 pounds. Decades of rich foods, synthetic luxury, and absolute authority have left him bloated and heavily reliant on advanced anti-gravity tech just to move his cumbersome frame from room to room. He never travels on foot. Instead, the governor navigates the sprawling corridors of his palace aboard a sleek, custom-built personal hovercraft that hums constantly beneath him, lifting his heavy 400-pound bulk a few inches off the polished flooring. More telling than the vehicle itself is the continuous shimmering field of energy surrounding it, personal repulsor shields that remain fully enabled 24 hours a day, buzzing with a faint, lethal blue charge. He keeps these shields powered up at all times, even when gliding through the private halls of his own stronghold, surrounded by his personal guards and administrative lackeys. The governor lives in a state of perpetual, jittery terror, entirely convinced that the billions of miserable workers down in the Arcology despise him so deeply that they are actively plotting day and night to overthrow him, assassinate him, and tear his tower down to its foundations. He imagines secret revolutionary cells lurking behind every ventilation shaft, waiting for a chance to strike him down. Yet, his paranoid fears are fundamentally detached from reality. The irony is absolute. None of his lackeys or middle-tier administrators have any desire whatsoever to get rid of him or disrupt the current power structure. In fact, they are more than happy with the way things are. They recognize that the governor's brutal quotas, relentless production demands, and total indifference to the suffering of the lower levels are precisely what keep the massive massive planetary machine running smoothly, and more importantly, ensure that they themselves remain safely cushioned in the upper tiers rather than cast down into the suffocating, toxic depths where a boy named Adam is currently fighting just to find a piece of scrap metal. The vaulted ceiling of the Grand Hall stretches upward into the upper reaches of the tower, soaring 50 meters above a massive circular table carved from synthetic black obsidian. Sunlight, unfiltered and brilliant, pours through towering transparent steel windows that look out over a blinding sea of white clouds, completely masking the toxic gray smog 2 kilometers below. Around the obsidian table sit 10 high-ranking officials, a carefully chosen mix of humans and a few distinct alien species characteristic of the broader galaxy, their sharp uniforms pressed and immaculate. At the head of the table, resting heavily upon a custom-built, ultra-reinforced grab sled, sits Governor Frederick. His massive, 400-pound frame overflows the reinforced cushions of the vehicle, his mottled green skin glistening with a light layer of nervous sweat under the bright sunlight. A constant, low-frequency hum vibrates through the air around him, generated by the personal repulsor shields that shimmer in a faint, electric blue halo encasing his hovercraft. Even here, surrounded by armed guards and his most trusted elite, the shields remain active, their humming field a testament to his unending, frantic paranoia. Frederick suddenly slams his heavy fist down onto the armrest, roaring about a universal 1% production drop across every sector, demanding to know who is behind the scheme and insisting that someone must be held to account. To Frederick's left sits Danielle, an administrative official who is not from this planet. Her presence in the upper tier is the result of a cosmic fluke. Years ago, her aging cargo freighter suffered a catastrophic hyperdrive malfunction while en route to her homeworld, forcing an emergency landing on this toxic industrial globe. By the time she and her crew managed to scrape together enough credits to fix the ship, years had passed, rust had consumed the vessel, and repair costs far exceeded its value. Stranded and desperate to avoid the miserable slums of the lower levels, Danielle scrubbed her past, applied her off-world organizational skills to the Arcology's bureaucratic machine, and climbed her way into the governor's inner circle. Now, seated in the brilliant sunlight, she maintains a polished, compliant exterior, playing her part in Frederick's theater of paranoia because keeping the wheels turning is her only guarantee of safety above the clouds. The grand hall of the command spire smelled of ozone, polished chromium, and the quiet, sterile scent of filtered oxygen that had never touched the toxic gray soup choking the rest of the world. Through towering transparent steel windows, blinding white clouds stretched away to every horizon, shutting out any view of the misery festering 2 kilometers below. Around the massive circular table carved from synthetic black obsidian sat the 10 highest-ranking officials of the sector, their immaculate uniforms stark against the dark stone. At the head of the table sat Governor Frederick. His massive, 400-pound frame overflowed the reinforced cushions of his custom grab sled, his mottled green skin glistening with a greasy sheen of nervous sweat. Surrounding him was a constant, low-frequency hum generated by the personal repulsor shields that shimmered in a faint, electric blue halo around his vehicle. Even here, in the safest room on the planet, guarded by heavily armed sentries standing at every doorway, the shields remained fully active. Frederick's paranoia was a living, breathing thing, a jagged edge that kept everyone in the room on high alert. Frederick slammed his heavy fist down onto the armrest of his sled, the metallic echo reverberating off the vaulted ceiling. His small, bloodshot eyes darted wildly across the faces of his subordinates. A universal 1% drop, across every single manufacturing sector. Do you take me for a fool? He roared, spittle flying from his lips. I want to know who is behind this scheme. I want the sabotage rooted out, and I want an example made. Someone is orchestrating this to undermine my authority, and they will pay with everything they have. To Frederick's left sat Danielle. She kept her posture impeccably straight, her hands resting calmly on the cool obsidian surface of the table. A former off-world freighter pilot whose ship had rotted away into a worthless hulk decades ago, she had clawed her way up from the bureaucratic trenches through sheer calculation and cold survival instinct. She knew how to play the game, how to soothe the massive tyrant, and how to keep her own head safely attached to her shoulders. She drew in a quiet breath, preparing to deliver her carefully rehearsed assessment. It is merely a minor drop, Governor, she began, her voice smooth and measured. The fluctuation is not a conspiracy, but simply the result of. She never got to finish the sentence. Frederick exploded. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as his face flushed a deep, mottled purple, with emotion so violent it nearly tipped his grab sled. He lunged forward, cutting her off entirely. Minor? Minor, he screamed, his voice cracking with unbridled fury. You dare sit there in the sunlight and tell me that systematic sabotage is a minor deviation? You think you can brush this away with bureaucratic platitudes while the machine falters? The other 9 officials froze, their eyes fixed rigidly on the tabletop, too terrified to even breathe. Danielle's calm exterior cracked just a fraction. Her fingers tightened against the obsidian edge as Frederick's bulging eyes locked onto hers with lethal intensity. You listen to me very carefully, Danielle, Frederick hissed, leaning so far forward that the shimmering blue energy of his personal repulsor shield crackled dangerously close to the table's edge. I am surrounded by incompetence and betrayal. You think this is a game of ledgers and margins? It is war, and someone has to answer for it. He jabbed a thick, sausage-like green finger directly at her chest. I want the culprit found, and if you don't find him in the next weekend, and fix the issues once and for all, your head will be on the chopping block. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the suffocating weight of his tyranny. Danielle knew the governor well enough to recognize the dead, flat look in his eyes. He wasn't using a metaphor. He meant it literally. Down in the sub-basement workshops, among the rusting machinery and industrial waste, there were automated guillotine-style maintenance blades historically used for shearing heavy piping. He would have her dragged down there, strapped to a frame, and severed from her neck simply to send a message to the rest of the trembling administration. For a terrifying second, the urge to panic threatened to swallow her whole. Years of scraping by, of playing the polite, compliant bureaucrat, of swallowing her pride and biting her tongue to stay alive in this floating palace, all rushed to the surface. She was trapped between the crushing gears of the planetary machine and the paranoid delusions of a bloated madman. But beneath the rising panic, the old freighter pilot instinct kicked in, the cold, calculating reflex of someone whose ship had failed mid-warp and who had only seconds to stabilize the reactor before it blew. Her expression hardened. The compliant, soothing mask melted away, replaced by a razor-sharp resolve. If she couldn't reason with him, she would have to give him a target. She would have to find a scapegoat among the lower-tier foremen before the weekend clock ran out, or else her own life would be forfeit. Understood, Governor, Danielle said, her voice dropping an octave, steady and chillingly calm. I will have the responsible party identified and dealt with before the weekend cycle closes. Frederick grunted, leaning back into his reinforced cushions as the low-frequency hum of his repulsor shield smoothed out into a steady drone. He waved a dismissive hand, already losing interest as his paranoid mind drifted to the next imagined threat lurking in the shadows of his fortress. You are dismissed, Frederick muttered, staring out past her toward the blinding clouds. Find the rat, or you are next. Chapter 2. The heavy blast doors of the executive suite hissed shut behind Danielle, sealing out the sterile, ozone-laced air of the Grand Hall and the lingering, suffocating dread of Governor Frederick's threat. Here, deep within her private office, the atmosphere was quiet, chilled to a crisp, artificial perfection. She walked across the expanse of dark, reflective flooring, her heels clicking a sharp, unforgiving rhythm that echoed against the minimalist walls. She did not stop until she reached the far wall, a towering wall of pristine transparent steel that curved outward and offered a dizzying, panoramic view stretching for thousands of kilometers across the upper atmosphere. Outside, a blinding sea of unbroken white clouds rolled beneath the endless expanse of the upper sky, glowing with the harsh, unfiltered brilliance of a sun that never reached the toxic depths below. From this height, the endless industrial sprawl, the grinding misery, and the billions of lives trapped in the perpetual gray gloom of the lower arcologies were completely invisible, erased by a comforting blanket of vapor. It was a view designed to make the rulers of this world forget that anything existed outside their pristine bubble. But for Danielle, the view served a very different purpose. It was a towering, silent reminder of how far she had fallen, and how fiercely she had fought just to keep from plunging back down into the dark. She placed her palms flat against the cold transparent steel, feeling the faint, high-frequency vibration of the tower's structural supports hum through her fingertips. At 22 years of age, she carried herself with the hard, impenetrable armor of someone twice her years. In the 6 vicious years since her life had fractured, she had learned that weakness was a fatal sentence, that hesitation was a slow death, and that trust was a currency spent only by fools. Every promotion, every cleared ledger, every rival she had outmaneuvered or quietly discredited along the administrative ladder had been purchased with a piece of her soul. She had stepped over ambitions, crushed alliances, and worn 1,000 compliant smiles to claw her way out of the industrial gutters and into the governor's inner circle. Yet, standing here in the silence of her office, the hard exterior wavered. The vast, empty horizon triggered something dangerous. It unlocked a door she kept firmly bolted shut, pulling her thoughts backward across the cold, unforgiving void of hyperspace to a world she had not seen in a lifetime. Ferriton. Just hearing the name in the quiet chambers of her mind brought an immediate, physical ache to her chest, a sudden rush of sensory memories so vivid they nearly overwhelmed the sterile scent of her office. Ferriton was not an industrial wasteland choked by sulfur and steel. It was a masterpiece of living green and deep sapphire, a vibrant, breathing world where the oceans rolled in gentle, sun-warmed tides against white sand beaches, and where vast, emerald forests stretched from horizon to horizon, humming with life. The air there did not taste of burnt oil and synthetic ash. It tasted of damp earth, sweet flowering vines, and crisp, salt-laden breezes that rustled through the broadleaf canopies. She closed her eyes, and for a fleeting, agonizing second, she wasn't standing in a steel and glass tower on a forgotten outer rim trading world. She was young again, running barefoot through the sun-dappled clearings of the southern continent, the warm soil giving way beneath her toes. She could hear the melodic, flute-like calls of native canopy birds echoing through the upper branches, and she could feel the careless, boundless freedom of a girl who believed the entire galaxy was laid out before her like an open treasure map. And in almost every memory of those golden days, Gangi was right beside her. Gangi, the very thought of him pulled a tight, painful knot into her throat. He had been her closest friend, a boy whose mind worked in ways ordinary people could never comprehend. While other children spent their days playing in the rivers or racing through the dense undergrowth, Gangi was always tearing things apart. He had an uncanny, almost magical affinity for technology. Give him a broken wrist comms unit, a shattered atmospheric probe, or a rusted agricultural drone, and within an hour he would have the casing off, his fingers moving with surgical precision, rewiring circuits and boosting power outputs until the machine did things its creators never intended. She remembered the time they found an ancient, pre-collapse atmospheric sensor half buried in the mud near the edge of a freshwater lake. It was dead, its power core long since rotted into useless slag, its internal processors fried by centuries of moisture. Most kids would have tossed it back into the water or used it as a skipping stone. Not Gangi. His eyes had lit up with that brilliant, fierce spark of pure curiosity that defined everything he did. He had hauled the heavy metal cylinder back to his family's workshop, a rustic open-air shed smelling of pine resin and ozone, and spent 3 days straight without sleep, scavenging parts from old water pumps and weaving together a crude, makeshift power bridge using copper wire and salvaged crystal shards. When he finally flipped the toggle switch, the dead machine didn't just turn on, it projected a holographic map of the entire planetary watershed, shimmering in vivid blue light across the wooden workbench, illuminating his grime-streaked face and wide, astonished eyes. He wasn't doing it for money, and he wasn't doing it for prestige. He did it simply because he had to know how things worked, because he viewed the broken, discarded pieces of the universe as puzzles waiting to be solved. He was fiercely inquisitive, endlessly inventive, and possessed a laugh that could cut through the heaviest gloom. They had spent countless hours sitting on the high rocky bluffs overlooking the Sapphire Sea, dreaming of the day they would build a ship of their own, leave Farad'n behind, and plunge into the stars to see what lay beyond the horizon. Then reality had intervened, sharp and brutal. The grand adventure had started with promise. Danielle's family had pooled every credit they possessed to secure passage on an aging, mid-tire transport vessel, buying into the glittering promises of economic expansion in the outer sectors. They were supposed to find fortune, establish a thriving trade enterprise, and eventually send for Gangi once they had carved out their piece of the galaxy. But the universe did not care about childhood dreams. Halfway through the transit route, deep in unmapped drift space, the transport's primary reactor suffered a catastrophic, cascading containment failure. The ship dropped out of hyperspace violently, tearing its own internal bulkheads apart and leaving them drifting in the cold, silent dark of dead space for weeks with failing life support. By the time an automated salvage tug finally hauled the drifting, battered hulk into port, Danielle's parents were gone, claimed by the toxic radiation leaks that had slowly poisoned the lower decks during the drift. She had survived, but she was entirely alone, stranded on this bleak, industrial nightmare of a planet with no credits, no connections, and no way back home. The sleek, beautiful transports she had dreamed of riding had vanished, replaced by the crushing reality of the Arcology's vertical slums. To avoid being swallowed by the flooded, crime-ridden ground floors, she had scrubbed her accent, buried her past, and traded her innocence for ambition. She had learned to lie, to manipulate, to smile while twisting the knife, climbing over every obstacle with the same fierce, survival-driven determination that Gangi had once applied to fixing broken machines. She opened her eyes, staring out at the blinding white clouds. The nostalgia faded, replaced once again by the cold, calculating focus of her current reality. She had survived by refusing to look back, by refusing to let weakness compromise her position. Yet, despite all her efforts to wall off her past, a strange and unsettling coincidence had begun to gnaw at the back of her mind over the past few standard cycles. It started with the whispered reports from the middle tire maintenance supervisors, casual mentions of an elusive, unrecorded kid living down in the lower shafts who had an impossible knack for repairing defunct hardware with practically nothing, a shadow in the rust, someone who slipped through sealed maintenance hatches using hand-tooled bypass tools that shouldn't have existed, bringing dead circuit boards back to life with scavenged copper and sheer ingenuity. But it wasn't just the technical skill that caught her attention. It was something deeper, a haunting echo she couldn't quite shake. The security logs and informant descriptions painted a picture of a human boy, roughly 10 to 12 years old, with light brown skin, an intense, restless curiosity in his eyes, and an innate, uncanny genius for electronics. Every time she heard a report of this unknown child working miracles with discarded wiring and flickering data pumps, a phantom image of Gangi sitting at his workbench on Farad'n flashed behind her eyes. It was impossible, of course. Gangi was light years away on a green planet she would likely never see again, living a life untouched by this industrial hell. But the parallel was too striking to ignore, a ghost from her past reaching out across the vertical gulf of the Arcology. Danielle shook her head sharply, dismissing the sentimentality before it could take root. This wasn't the time for ghosts or childhood memories. She had a massive crisis on her hands, a looming deadline imposed by a paranoid tyrant, and a week to find a scapegoat or face the executioner's blade. She turned away from the panoramic window, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she strode toward her desk to access the security archives. If there was a clever, tech-savvy kid running through the service tunnels of the lower levels, perhaps he was the exact piece she needed on her board to solve the governor's crisis and secure her own survival. A dumb hung suspended in the suffocating gloom 200 feet above a pitch-black industrial chasm, his weight anchored entirely by a fraying length of synthetic fiber cord lashed around a rusted structural beam overhead. The air here was no longer just damp. It was thick, roiling with a stifling wave of radiant heat exhaled by hidden generator manifolds buried deep within the Arcology's spine. Every breath tasted of scorched copper and ionized sweat, burning the back of his throat as the metallic din of the lower levels morphed into a continuous, deafening industrial roar. Deep in the abyss beneath him, massive hydraulic presses hammered in a sluggish, rhythmic cadence, sending heavy vibrations shuddering up through the cables and rattling his teeth. He swung his legs out over the void, his boots kicking against empty space as a violent surge of vertigo struck him. The sheer scale of the vertical drop was sickening, a dizzying vertical ocean of shadows where the faint neon glow of the lower bazaar looked like dying embers at the bottom of a well. He didn't look down. Instead, he forced his focus upward onto the next terrifying leg of his climb, a chaotic, tangled web of high-voltage wiring, stripped conduits, and jagged metal gussets jutting out from the sheer arcology wall 50 feet above. Releasing the primary line, Adam scrambled onto the vertical trellis of cables, his fingers finding purchase on the slick, hot insulation of thick power trunks. The wiring hummed violently beneath his palms, alive with surging current that made his skin prickle with static electricity. Every handhold was a gamble against greased metal and snapping strands, the heat intensifying with every foot he gained as he clawed his way higher toward a small, reinforced service platform bolted into the bulkhead. Reaching the platform, Adam hauled himself over the lip, his chest heaving as he gulped down the searing, ozone-heavy air. From this vantage point, his objective lay across a treacherous expanse, a narrow utility bridge spanning 200 feet of empty space directly toward an access hatch on the opposite wall. The bridge was barely 2 feet wide, fitted with only a single, rusted safety railing meant exclusively for maintenance droids on magnetic treads. To anyone else, it was a death trap, but Adam had walked this razor-thin span a dozen times before, as the furnace-like blast of nearby exhaust vents washed over his back, pushing the ambient temperature into the high 90s. He stepped onto the narrow span. His boots found their familiar, rhythmic stride on the gridiron floor, the single railing vibrating under his white-knuckled grip as he crossed the dizzying chasm with practiced, desperate precision toward the override panel that would grant him access to the sector's hidden interior. Adam pressed his back flat against the freezing corrugated steel of the bulkhead, the vibrating hum of the utility bridge fading beneath the relentless, metallic heartbeat of the arcology's internal machinery. Before him sat the prize, a heavy, resist maintenance hatch sealed tight by a matte black biometric locking plate that pulsed with a faint, amber warning light. This wasn't just a physical barrier of reinforced alloy, it was a digital gatekeeper wired directly into the arcology's lower tier subnetwork, guarding the classified internal service arteries that spiderwebbed across the vertical city. For an ordinary scavenger, this door was the end of the line, but Adam was carrying the cracked dataput he had dragged out of the recycling chute yesterday, a piece of salvage that had undergone a crude, underground metamorphosis in his hands. He pulled the battered device from his pocket, his thumb brushing over the flickering green display that cast an eerie, emerald glow across his hollow, soot-streaked cheeks. As a level 1 netrunner in the brutal survival school of the streets, Adam's digital penetration abilities were raw, primitive, and terrifyingly risky. He didn't have sleek, military-grade cyberdex or clean, fiber-optic jack-in ports. Instead, his toolkit consisted of a frayed hand-tooled interface cable wired directly into the dataput's stripped auxiliary bus. To hack a door meant physically bridging the dataput into the local maintenance terminal's exposed data conduit, exposing his rig to the raw, unfiltered threat of the arcology's automated defensive countermeasures. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird as he knelt before the lock. The air here smelled heavily of melting wire insulation and stagnant grease, thick enough to choke on. With trembling fingers, Adam stripped the rubber shielding off the end of his interface cable, exposing a tangle of hair-thin copper filaments. He leaned forward, squinting through the gloom at the micro port beneath the lock plate, and carefully jammed the copper strands into the data pins. Instantly, the dataput in his hand vibrated violently. The flickering green screen dissolved into a cascading waterfall of raw hexadecimal code, scrolling past at a dizzying speed. Adam bit his lower lip hard enough to draw a bead of copper-tasting blood. At his level, his penetration abilities were strictly limited to low-security administrative relays, the kinds of basic locks used to seal off empty utility shafts and discarded storage bays. He couldn't crack military-grade encryption or slip past hardened firewall protocols. One wrong command, one mistimed loop in his crude bypass script, and the local defense matrix would flag the intrusion instantly. And when the system flagged an intruder, it didn't send human guards. The thought alone made his stomach twist into a hard, freezing knot. If the automated security grid detected his unauthorized digital signature probing its subroutines, it would instantly dispatch a squad of perimeter defense drones from the ceiling nests overhead. These weren't sluggish inspection units. They were sleek, lethal hunters equipped with heavy stunt sockets designed to lock up human nervous systems with high-voltage arcs, and devastating plasma rotators capable of melting through solid steel, or a human chest, in less than a second. If they caught him out here on this narrow ledge with nowhere to run, he wouldn't even have time to scream before he was reduced to a smoking heap of ash tumbling down into the dark abyss. He watched the screen with wide, unblinking eyes. The amber light on the hatch pulsed faster, shifting from a steady glow to an aggressive, stuttering flash. The security demon was pushing back, actively hunting the foreign code bleeding into its port. A wall of crimson warning text flashed across the bottom of the dataput. Access denied. Anomaly detected in Sector 4B. Panic surged through Adam's veins, hot and sharp. The system was locking down. The countdown to a lethal counterstrike had begun. In 3 seconds, the automated defense protocols would trace the feedback loop straight down the cable and fry his dataput, and probably his nervous system along with it. Don't panic. Just bypass the handshake protocol, he told himself, his mind racing back to the countless hours he had spent reverse engineering fried circuit boards in the dark. Instead of fighting the firewall head-on, Adam executed a dirty, brute force routing trick he had learned from an old, half-mad data smuggler 3 tiers down. He severed the primary data line on his screen, manually short-circuiting the datapod's half-charged power cell to dump a massive, unregulated surge of raw voltage directly back down the interface cable. It was a suicidal gamble. If he miscalculated the resistance, the feedback would blow up the datapod in his hands, searing his fingers to the bone. He slammed his thumb down on the execution command. A sharp, electric snap echoed in the cramped alcove, accompanied by a blinding flash of blue-white light that singed his eyebrows. The datapod went completely dead in his grip, the green screen blinking out into total blackness. Adam gasped, dropping the smoking device onto the metal grating, his hands recoiling as if he had touched a glowing plasma coil. For a horrifying second, he thought he had failed, that he had just destroyed his only prized possession for nothing. Then, deep within the bulkhead, came a heavy, mechanical clunk. The amber light on the biometric plate flickered violently, turned a solid, welcoming green, and with a hiss of escaping pressurized air, the massive heavy-duty maintenance hatch slowly slid inward, revealing the dark, cavernous service tunnel beyond. Adam let out a long, shuddering breath that felt like it had been trapped in his lungs for an hour. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, his skin slick with a cold layer of nervous sweat that contrasted sharply with the radiating heat of the arcology walls. He snatched up the darkened datapod from the floor, pocketing it alongside a salvaged micro-power regulator, and without wasting a single second, he scrambled through the newly opened threshold, diving headfirst into the shadows just as the distant, whirring whine of automated defense drones spooling up echoed from the upper ceiling vents. Deep within the dark, labyrinthine arteries of the service tunnel, the air was dead and heavy with the metallic tang of cooling oil and ancient dust. Shadows clung to the rusted steel ribs of the corridor, parting only to reveal a tall, gaunt figure hunched under a brutal burden. Slung across the man's broad back was a coarse, heavy sack containing an irregular, bulky device that clinked dully with every strained step he took. He moved with a frantic, jerky gait, his long limbs casting erratic shapes against the curved walls. Every metallic paying of cooling pipes, every distant groan of the arcology's shifting framework made him freeze. His head whipped back and forth, eyes wide and bloodshot in the dim emergency lighting, tracking non-existent pursuers. Yet, beneath the terror that threatened to choke him, a cold, unyielding resolve anchored his movements. He knew what was at stake. He knew the purpose of his clandestine mission. Buried deep inside the sack was a damp-sealed relay module designed to interface directly with the primary security perimeter system. It would sit dormant, an invisible sleeper cell wired into the digital nervous system of the station, waiting patiently for a precise future moment. When activated, it would bypass the central subroutines and silently unlock a specific vault door, a classified target whose contents remained a mystery even to him. His handlers had given him only one directive, and the heavy weight of that responsibility was the only thing keeping his trembling legs moving forward. Suddenly, a sharp scrape of a boot echoed ahead. The tall man sucked in a sharp breath, ducking instinctively behind a massive junction pillar. Just around the curve of the tunnel, a maintenance technician carrying a diagnostic kit stepped out from across corridor, intending to check a failing pressure valve. The technician froze, his eyes widening in sheer shock at the sight of an unauthorized intruder lurking in the restricted service conduits. Without a second thought, the worker's hand darted toward the emergency alert console mounted on the bulkhead, fingers clawing for the manual alarm trigger that would bring down blast doors and automated security teams within seconds. There was no time for hesitation, no room for mercy. Thousands of lives, and the entire future hanging on this mission, flashed before the tall man's mind. With blinding speed, he dropped the heavy sack, his hand sweeping down to snatch a jagged, foot-long shard of rusted structural metal from the floor. Before the technician's fingers could slap the red alarm plate, the tall man lunged forward out of the shadows. The improvised blade swept in a swift, brutal arc, cutting short the worker's startled gasp and bringing him down instantly onto the cold, grease-stained grating. The tall man didn't look back, breathing heavily, his heart hammering against his ribs. He shouldered his heavy burden once again and plunged deeper into the dark, labyrinthine corridor toward his destination. The tall man moved through the labyrinth of the inner service conduit with the terrifying efficiency of a seasoned operative. Unlike the clumsy, brute force intrusions common among street scavengers, he was a level 10 technological penetrator, a master of digital and mechanical infiltration whose very presence in the system was treated by the arcology's defenses as a ghost in the machine. He did not hack, he negotiated with the architecture, pausing before the primary junction box of the sector's security perimeter system. He pulled a compact, matte black bypass unit from his belt and pressed its integrated magnetic clamp directly against the reinforced casing. A soft, melodic chime rippled through the cold metal of the conduit, signaling the immediate collapse of the junction's encryption protocols. The station's firewalls didn't fight him, they rolled over like docile beasts, recognizing his high-level authorization signature as an administrative command. With fluid, practiced motions, he unlatched the heavy steel panel, exposing the dense nest of glowing fiber optic cables and pulsing power relays within. He slid his custom-built sleeper device into the heart of the junction, wiring it directly into the core data bus. The installation was seamless, silent, and instantaneous. The device clicked into place, locking its physical housing with a permanent magnetic seal and burying its digital payload deep within the subroutines where it would remain completely dormant, waiting for the precise future moment when it would unlock that heavily guarded vault door. Without lingering for a fraction of a second, the tall man shouldered his empty sack, spun around, and melted back into the shadows of the conduit, leaving behind no trace of his passage except for a ghost code that hummed quietly in the dark. Miles away, wrapped in the suffocating heat and perpetual industrial heartbeat of the lower maintenance shafts, Adam navigated the twisting corridors with the instinct of a rat running a familiar maze. His lungs burned slightly from the stale, ozone-heavy air, but his hands moved with absolute confidence. By tracking a series of feigned, deliberate scratch marks and glowing paint tags he had carved into the rusted metal ribs during previous expeditions, he bypassed the dead end grates and hazardous steam vents that had stopped other scavengers in their tracks. Within minutes, he had pushed past a rusted security flap into a sprawling section of the arcology he had never explored before. He stepped out into what had once been an old residential unit, a cramped modular block suspended within the vertical superstructure that had been abruptly sealed off and abandoned a decade ago during a catastrophic sector breakdown. When the power had been permanently cut to this quadrant 5 years back, time had effectively stopped here. The air was dead, cold, and heavy with the scent of undisturbed dust and decaying polymers. Adam swept the beam of his makeshift flashlight across the decayed interior. The scene looked frozen in a tragic state of sudden interruption. A small, grease-stained table still held chipped synthetic cups and a child's worn plastic toy, while clothing hung limp from rusted wall hooks, rotting away into gray threads. The bunks were stripped and covered in a thick blanket of soot, and every digital display on the walls was dead and dark. Yet, for a scavenger, this tomb was a treasure trove. Because the sector had been sealed off and forgotten for years, the scavengers of the lower levels had never looted it. Everything left behind by the panicked residents a decade ago was still sitting right where they had dropped it. Moving quietly across the warped floor plating, Adam approached a Resist entertainment and communication console embedded in the bulkhead. Its casing was cracked, but its internal components were protected from the corrosive moisture of the open shafts. With careful, reverent fingers, he unscrewed the front faceplate and pulled out what he had been searching for, a small, intact residential communicator unit. He popped open its casing, carefully extracting the pristine micro data bridge connector and the auxiliary power regulation node nestled inside. He held the two salvage pieces up to the dim glow of his flashlight, a victorious grin breaking across his soot-streaked face. These were the exact components he needed to repair his cracked dataput. With the micro power regulator and the clean data bridge secured, he could finally finish rebuilding his primary tool and unlock a whole new tier of digital capabilities. As Adam carefully stowed the salvage components into his worn jacket pocket, the ambient hum of the arcology seemed to fade for a moment, replaced by the crisp, familiar interface of the system's underlying mechanics. Welcome to the progression matrix. It is time to break the fourth wall for a brief moment and look under the hood at how Adam's survival translates into tangible progression in this world. By successfully executing a high-stakes digital break-in against a live security lock, pulling off complex micro-repairs in the field without getting caught by lethal automated drones, and navigating extreme environmental hazards, Adam has accumulated a substantial pool of experience points. Every narrow escape and clever workaround yields measurable growth in this brutal vertical ecosystem. Let us examine his current character building tree and skill sets as he hits this critical milestone in his journey. Bullet level, 2 Scavenger Netrunner hybrid experience points, XP, 1,452,000 to level 3 core attribute scores, Dexterity, 14, enhanced by years of narrow escapes, tightrope walking across utility bridges, and scaling vertical cable webs intelligence, 15, driven by self-taught electronics repair, reverse engineering fried circuit boards, and decoding low-level security scripts, Stealth, 13, refined by the absolute necessity of staying invisible to local enforcers, scrap dealers, and automated defense grids endurance. 12, forged through navigating extreme heat, toxic air, and exhausting physical climbs. Active skill tree and abilities. Low-level digital penetration. Rank 2, allows for the bypassing of basic biometric door locks, residential terminals, and auxiliary maintenance relays using improvised copper interfaces and cracked dataputs. Vulnerable to high tire countermeasures. Scrap engineering. Rank 3, mastery in salvaging, stripping, and repurposing dead technology, military-grade wire scraps, and defunct power cells into working improvised tools. Vertical traversing. Rank 2, proficiency in scaling high-altitude industrial structures, utilizing maintenance cables, and managing severe vertigo under high-stress conditions. Shadow evasion. Rank 1, passive skill granting a minor bonus to stealth checks when operating within unlit service tunnels and avoiding automated drone sensor sweeps. The primary objective of this current campaign arc is simple yet perilous. Adam must fully restore his cracked dataput using the salvaged components from the abandoned residential unit, upgrade his net running capabilities to bypass mid-tier security gates, and uncover the truth behind the suspicious power fluctuations rocking the arcology, all while staying one step ahead of Governor Frederick's paranoid enforcers and Danielle's desperate administrative manhunt. The training wheels are off, the system is watching, the progression tree is expanding, and the choices Adam makes next will determine whether he rises through the ranks of this vertical world or plunges permanently into the dark, flooded abyss below. Inside his private sanctum at the pinnacle of the command spire, Governor Frederick sat enshrined within his massive protection pod, the custom grab sled hovering an inch above the polished obsidian floor. Even here, locked behind biometric blast doors and surrounded by his most trusted guards, the feigned, lethal blue charge of his personal repulsor shield crackled continuously around him. The air in the room was cold and sterile, but sweat glistened on his mottled green skin as he fumed over the 1% production drop. His paranoid mind churned with dark suspicions. Danielle had better uncover the saboteur quickly, because if heads were going to roll, hers would be first. She had risen through the administrative ranks with terrifying speed, displacing veterans and drawing the quiet, bitter resentment of the entire leading council. Whispers of widespread discontent among the high officials had reached his sharp, forward-pointed ears, convincing him that a coordinated coup was brewing right beneath his nose. Suddenly, the encrypted holographic projector on his central console flared to life, casting a flickering, translucent blue glow across the room. The incoming transmission came from Sector General Franklin, commanding officer of the Outer Border Patrol. The image that resolved above the deck was alarming. Franklin's flagship was clearly visible, its hull scarred by severe plasma burns, gaping structural breaches, and sparking conduits that hinted at a brutal, devastating engagement. Franklin wasted no time on pleasantries, his voice grim and gravelly as he reported that their patrol wing had been ambushed by a coordinated pack of heavily armed rebel ships along the border sectors. Out of the 15 vessels that had sortied, 10 had been utterly destroyed, and the 5 survivors remaining were limping home with critical structural and propulsion damage, demanding immediate dry dock repairs. Then, the conversation shifted into a dense, highly technical exchange regarding shipboard architecture, quantum drive synchronization, and specialized alloy plating. While the dialogue sounded routine to an outsider, it triggered a cold spike of absolute terror in Frederick's chest. Sector General Franklin was a notoriously volatile commander, a man whose brutal competence was matched only by his destructive temper when things did not go his way. Worse still, Frederick knew the brutal reality of their industrial supply chain. The specific high-grade components required to repair Franklin's advanced warship simply did not exist anywhere within the Arcology's depleted reserves. Yet, admitting that failure to a dangerous warlord like Franklin was a death sentence, Frederick couldn't tell him the parts were missing without inviting an immediate, violent mutiny at the very gates of his tower. The holographic projection of Sector General Franklin flickered slightly, casting an eerie, cobalt light over Governor Frederick's bloated, green-skinned face. The air inside the private sanctum hummed with the high-frequency snap of the active repulsor shield, a pale blue halo that caged the governor within his massive protection pod. Frederick's terrifying white eyes narrowed as he stared at the heavily scarred hull of Franklin's flagship, his mind racing desperately for a way out of the impossible trap he had just fallen into. He knew the Arcology's industrial bays were empty of the quantum-grade alloys and specialized drive coils the general required. Admitting that truth meant inviting a military mutiny at the summit of his own tower. Frederick leaned forward, pressing his heavy hands against the console, and forced a thin, oily smile onto his face. "General, let us look at the broader logistical picture here," Frederick began, his voice carrying a calculated tone of administrative authority. "Bringing a heavily battered fleet directly into the primary command spire dry dock poses an unnecessary security risk to our core processing infrastructure. Furthermore, the atmospheric congestion here is already operating at critical thresholds." Franklin's holographic avatar crossed his arms, his rugged face darkening with suspicion. "What are you implying, Governor?" "I am simply proposing a more tactically sound reallocation of resources," Frederick pressed on, sweating profusely as his paranoid mind scrambled for a plausible diversion. "Planet Sierra Alpha 3 would serve as a far superior dry dock location for your surviving vessels. It possesses deep-crust planetary stabilization platforms, wide berths, and isolated staging yards that will keep your strike wing safe from prying eyes while repairs are underway." The silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate. Franklin did not move a muscle, his hard, unblinking stare locked onto Frederick with an intensity that made the governor's internal dampeners strain to keep his grav sled stable. "Sierra Alpha 3, Franklin repeated, his voice dropping an octave, flat and chillingly dangerous. That rusted, stripped-down rock at the absolute edge of the system? A gravity well with zero manufacturing capacity, zero tactical support, and barely enough atmospheric scrubbers to keep a stray freighter breathing? It is a secure staging ground," Frederick stammered, the oily confidence beginning to crack under the general's blistering gaze. "You are hiding something, Frederick," Franklin snarled, the veins in his neck bulging as a violent surge of extreme anger flared through his posture. "For the past 20 cycles, every time a border fleet takes heavy fire, you try to push us away from the central hubs. You sit up there in your gilded, cloud-shrouded spire, completely detached from the blood we spilled to keep your supply lines open, and now you want to stash my wounded ships on a dead rock because you refuse to help us? General, you misunderstand the gravity of our current production quotas," Frederick started, raising a hand in defense. "Save your bureaucratic garbage," Franklin interrupted, his voice echoing with suppressed fury. "I know your type, Governor. You hoard resources while the frontier burns, but I am not some low-tire laborer you can dismiss with a slide deck. If you are unwilling to assist your own military vanguard, it makes me wonder what else you are hiding up there in that paranoid shell of yours." "Franklin, listen to reason." "I am done listening," Franklin snapped, his eyes flashing with lethal contempt. "I will be at your primary docking ring in 5 days. Have every specialized drive component, every plate of quantum armor, and every master technician waiting on the tarmac when my ships touch down. If the yards aren't ready, your head will roll." The irony hit Frederick like a physical blow. Just minutes ago, he had been sitting in this exact chair plotting how to sever Danielle's head from her shoulders if she failed to find a scapegoat for a minor 1% production drop. Now, the sector general was flying straight toward his doorstep with 5 damaged warships and a literal guillotine waiting for the governor himself if the hangars were empty. Before Frederick could utter another syllable of desperate excuse, Franklin severed the communications link. The blue holographic projection dissolved instantly into thin air, leaving the governor alone in the chilling silence of his sanctum, save for the crackle of his repulsor shield. For a terrifying moment, Frederick sat frozen, the blood draining from his face as the sheer weight of the impending disaster crashed down upon him. 5 days. 5 days until a violent, heavily armed military commander docked at his station expecting impossible repairs. But panic was a luxury a governor could not afford for long. Swallowing hard, Frederick slammed his fist down onto the internal comms console, immediately summoning his inventory managing director to the private sanctum. Within minutes, the director, a nervous, hollow-eyed human bureaucrat smothered in cascading data slates, stood trembling before the floating protection pod. Frederick grilled him ruthlessly, demanding a complete, itemized audit of every warehouse, scrap pile, and reserve bin across all 30 tiers of the arcology. To Frederick's intense shock, the audit revealed that things were not quite as catastrophic as he had initially feared. Thanks to decades of aggressive hoarding and ruthless quota enforcement, the lower and middle industrial sectors actually held a surprising surplus of standard hull plating, wiring harnesses, and secondary plasma manifolds. The bulk of Franklin's repair manifests could actually be met without completely collapsing the arcology's internal infrastructure. However, as the director's finger scrolled down to the bottom of the master ledger, the blood drained from Frederick's face once more. 2 major quantum drive components, the ultra-rare, high-density magnetic core regulators required to stabilize the primary warp engines of Franklin's Class 4 flagships, were entirely missing from the inventory. Without those 2 specific parts, the surviving warships could not engage their hyperdrives, rendering them permanently grounded sitting ducks. And worst of all, those components were not manufactured anywhere within this sector. They had to be imported from Deep Core Systems, a supply chain that had been severed years ago. Those 2 missing components meant the entire repair operation would stall out, and when Franklin realized he had been handed broken promises, the 5-day countdown to Frederick's execution would reach its 0 hour. What followed was 5 days of absolute, unadulterated hell for Governor Frederick. The days blurred into an endless, agonizing gauntlet of high-stress crisis meetings, frantic administrative roll calls, and relentless communications calls with Franklin's vanguard officers to verify exact damage reports and coordinate incoming telemetry. Every waking second was consumed by the crushing terror of the impending deadline. Frederick's mood deteriorated from nervous paranoia into a frothing, volcanic rage that sent every servant, guard, and middle-tier official scrambling for cover whenever his grab sled humped down the corridor. He barked impossible orders, threatened executions for minor clerical errors, and pushed the arcology's manufacturing lines to 150% capacity, driving the exhausted human workforce to the absolute brink of structural collapse. By the time the final evening of the work week arrived, the 5 days had nearly run their course. The walls were closing in, the military fleet was breathing down his neck, and the missing quantum drive components were still nowhere to be found. Frederick sat in his dark sanctum, staring out past the transparent steel windows at the gathering clouds, his mind burning with a desperate, toxic fury. The weekend had practically arrived. Franklin was almost at the door, the inventory was critically flawed, and Danielle's promised deadline to solve the arcology's internal sabotage crisis was colliding with this military nightmare. Danielle better have a damn good reason for what was going on down below, because if she couldn't deliver a miraculous scapegoat, a stabilized workforce, and a solution to his cascading failures by morning, her head would be the very first one rolling across the obsidian floor to appease the general. Adam sat alone in the dim shadows of the abandoned residential unit, the only sound in the dead room being the quiet hum of his newly rebuilt datapad resting on the scarred table before him. The repair had not merely restored the device, through sheer intuitive brilliance and the upgraded micro-components scavenged from the console, he had inadvertently pushed its processing architecture far beyond its original factory specifications. The screen glowed with a crisp, stable emerald brilliance, cycling through advanced diagnostics and subroutines whose true depth he hadn't yet begun to unlock. He looked down at the meager foil-wrapped meal of nutrient paste he had managed to purchase using a handful of credits earned by trading away some leftover scrap components to a shady dealer down on level 8. As he ate in silence, a heavy wave of melancholy settled over his chest. He thought of his parents, picturing them right now staggering through another exhausting shift in the upper-tier industrial levels, their bodies broken by decades of relentless labor just to keep them alive. He hated seeing them work nearly to death, trapped in an endless cycle of misery while the elites lived in luxury above the clouds, and he wished more than anything that he could somehow change their fate. Miles away, amid the suffocating crush of workers lining up in a dank concrete corridor for the start of another 15-hour shift, Adam's father stood tall above the crowd. The massive, heavily scarred man with 2 decades of plasma burns etched into his skin was none other than the tall operative who had carried the sleeper device through the service tunnels. In the dim light of the muster station, he caught the eye of a fellow underground contact passing by, offering a subtle, tightly controlled hand gesture to signal that the mission was accomplished and the security system was successfully compromised. The rebellion was moving into its next phase, and he was a central pillar of it. Back in the quiet isolation of the ruined apartment, Adam turned his attention away from his cold meal and back to the datapad. Deprived of any formal schools, public programs, or teachers, he had built his own curriculum through trial, error, and relentless self-education. He plugged a high-density data stick he had salvaged from the apartment's central terminal directly into the datapod's new data bridge connector. The screen flooded with a massive, cascading catalog of information. It was an archived backup library containing billions of documents, technical manuals, historical records, and comprehensive educational courses spanning dozens of advanced scientific fields. As the data indexing completed, a synthetic, localized advisory interface initialized on the screen, functioning as a primitive artificial intelligence companion that he could query, learn from, and interrogate for answers in his ongoing quest to understand the universe. Every educational module he completed, every technical schematic he mastered, and every complex algorithm he solved poured a steady stream of experience points into his progression matrix. His intelligence attribute climbed, his net running rank advanced, and his skill tree expanded, laying the foundation for a future where a kid from the lower arcology wouldn't just survive the machine, but learn how to take it apart piece by piece. Adam tapped the glowing emerald surface of the datapod, and the interface shifted instantly, shedding its cold system diagnostics to boot up a forgotten tactical simulation program nestled deep within the salvaged data stick. The screen blinked alive, casting a vibrant green illumination across his soot-streaked face. In the center of the display sat an interactive virtual workspace, displaying a wireframe schematic of a compact, multi-role atmospheric shuttle meant for a crew of no more than 6 souls. It was an engineering marvel reduced to absolute scrap, its exterior hull plating buckled, its port maneuvering thruster sheared off completely, and its internal life support conduits fried into a tangled mess of carbonized copper. Yet, as Adam zoomed in with a pinch of his fingers, he saw that the structural keel and titanium alloy substructure were entirely intact. It was the ultimate digital sandbox for a kid who had spent his life staring up at the stars through a shattered glass dome. Representing Adam inside the simulation was a tiny, squiggly avatar with oversized goggles and a frantically wagging tail. A humorous little sprite he had programmed into the datapod's boot sector just to keep himself amused during the long, freezing hours in the dark. The game interface flashed a bright prompt across the top of the viewport. Hull integrity 12%. Salvage or perish. Level 1 shipbuilding module. In the chat stream overlay that Adam had wired into the corner of his personal HUD, simulating his dream of one day broadcasting his repairs to the wider galaxy, a flurry of imaginary viewer comments scrolled past, cheering on the little squiggly guy as he strapped on a virtual plasma torch and prepared to dive headfirst into the mangled hull. Adam gripped the edge of the datapod, his heart racing with excitement as he took manual control of the squiggly mechanic. Using the touch-sensitive grid, he navigated his tiny avatar through a gaping plasma tear in the shuttle's dorsal plating, dropping straight into the ruined cockpit. The interior detail of the starship was staggering. Every toggle switch, circuit breaker, and secondary manifold was rendered in hyper-realistic technical precision. The pilot seats were chaired frames, the primary flight console was dripping with melted polymer, and the central navigation computer was completely dead. But Adam knew that spaceships weren't about the shiny exterior paint. They were living, breathing machines built on logic, pressure, and power flow. Step 1. Clear the debris. He guided the squiggly avatar over to a massive chunk of twisted bulkhead wedged directly across the pilot's primary flight yoke. With a quick tap of the salvage tool icon, his avatar pulled out a virtual heavy-duty plasma cutter. Sparks flew across the screen in a brilliant shower of green pixels as the squiggly guy carefully traced the stress lines of the metal, making sure not to nick the underlying hydraulic lines. With a satisfying mechanical clonk in the simulation audio, the severed chunk of steel broke free. Adam swiped his thumb to the side, and the squiggly avatar kicked the heavy debris out into the vacuum of space, clearing the path to the flight controls. Step 2. Rewire the auxiliary power bus. This was where Adam's natural genius truly shone. The simulation presented a maddeningly complex puzzle of fried circuit nodes, blown fuses, and crossed data lines leading from the secondary power cell to the cockpit avionics. If he hooked the positive lead into the wrong node, a simulated electrical surge would instantly fry the entire dashboard, sending the little squiggly avatar flying backward in a comical puff of digital smoke. Adam leaned in close, his eyes darting across the schematic diagrams flashing in the corner of the screen. He recognized this architecture instantly. It shared the same logic flow as the air filtration valves in the lower industrial shafts, just scaled up for deep space flight. Using his stylus, he grabbed the virtual wiring harness, routing a heavy-gauge positive cable around the blown capacitor bank and bridging it directly into the primary flight computer's auxiliary relay. He spliced a secondary ground wire using salvaged copper nodes, exactly the way he had practiced in real life with his datapod repairs. He held his breath and tapped the master ignition switch on the virtual console. For an agonizing second, nothing happened. The screen flickered dark, and the little squiggly avatar crossed its tiny arms, tapping its foot in mock disappointment as the chat stream simulated a wave of sad emotes. Then, deep within the digital bowels of the shuttle, a low, rhythmic thrum vibrated through the speakers. A soft amber light washed over the cockpit interior as the emergency avionics booted up one by one. The navigation screens flickered to life, displaying star charts, atmospheric pressure readings, and engine diagnostics in crisp, beautiful green text. The life support systems engaged with the hiss of pressurized oxygen, blowing AWA. Chapter 3. Deep beneath the deafening, rhythmic thunder of the heavy plasma forges in Sector 4, far below the prying optics of the Arcology's automated security grid, a massive, rusted coolant reservoir chamber sat empty. The air here was suffocating, thick with the acrid stench of sulfur and the metallic tang of dried machine blood. Shadows clung to the curved, Condensation slicked walls, shivering with every heavy hydraulic strike that echoed from the active foundries above. John stood perfectly still in the center of the gloom, even in the dim, flickering light of a dying emergency lumen. His towering, 6-foot-plus frame was imposing. His massive shoulders were tense, the thick muscles of his arms corded tight beneath his soot-stained work jacket. He rubbed his heavily scarred knuckles, tracing the jagged ridges of old plasma burns while he waited. He was exhausted, his bones aching from a brutal 15-hour shift on the welding lines, but adrenaline pushed the fatigue aside. From the absolute darkness of the eastern access tunnel, a faint, high-frequency hum began to vibrate through the damp air. John dropped his hands to his sides, his posture stiffening as 6 figures emerged from the blackness. They moved without a single footstep echoing on the grated floor, gliding into the dim light of the reservoir like ghosts drawn from the static of a dead holoscreen. None of them had a discernible face, none of them even had a defined physical form. They were utilizing black market digital scramblers, highly illegal, military-grade camouflage rigs strapped to their chests that projected a localized, spherical distortion field around their bodies. Looking at them was like staring through a cracked prism into a storm of dead pixels. Their outlines constantly shifted and blurred, their height seemingly fluctuating as the holographic camouflage fragmented the light around them. Where a head should be, there was only a swirling vortex of gray and black static. Where arms and legs moved, the space simply warped, bending the background pipes and rusted walls into sickening, funhouse mirror reflections. It was a perfect, absolute anonymity. Even if the governor's enforcers were recording the meeting, all they would capture was a visual void. One of the static-shrouded figures stepped forward. When it spoke, the voice was run through a heavy synthetic modulator, stripping away all traces of gender, age, or accent. It sounded like grinding metal and synthesized wind. The perimeter relay is in place, the voice stated flatly. The sleeper code is dormant within the primary junction. You executed the installation flawlessly, John. John offered a single, tight nod. He didn't speak. In this circle, words were a liability. The figure shifted, the static field around it rippling violently for a second before stabilizing. What Danielle and the governor's lapdogs believe is a minor, unexplainable 1% drop in planetary manufacturing efficiency is not a statistical anomaly. It is us. A second figure stepped up beside the first, its modulated voice echoing the exact same flat, metallic tone. The 1% margin was carefully calculated. It is the exact threshold of failure that triggers administrative panic without triggering a full-scale military lockdown of the lower levels. For the past 3 months, we have been systematically bleeding the arcology supply lines, misalligned sorting algorithms on the textile belts, microscopic fractures induced in the atmospheric scrubber valves, routed shipments of raw hyperalloy diverted into the incinerator chutes. It is 1,000 tiny, invisible cuts. We are starving the beast just enough to make it thrash, the first figure resumed. And right now, Governor Frederick is thrashing exactly the way we anticipated. He is looking inward, hunting shadows and blaming his own counsel. His paranoia is blinding him to the true threat, which means the board is finally set for the next phase. John crossed his massive arms over his chest, his brow furrowing deep beneath his grime-streaked forehead. Phase 2, he rumbled, his deep, gravelly voice cutting through the hum of the scramblers. Tell me what is coming. The 6 figures seemed to tighten their loose circle around him, the distortion fields overlapping and bleeding into one another like a wall of gray static. In 5 days, General Franklin is bringing 5 heavily damaged warships into the primary upper atmosphere dry docks, the leader said. The general is demanding a massive influx of specialized quantum drive components and heavy hull plating. The upper administrative tiers are currently in a state of absolute, blind panic trying to source materials they simply do not have. Every security eye, every enforcement drone, and every administrative lackey will be staring at the sky, focused entirely on the docking ring and the military vanguard. Which leaves the ground floor wide open, John murmured, the tactical reality snapping into focus. Exactly, the second figure replied, but we are not just using the distraction, we are using the convoy itself. Franklin's ships are limping, they are dragging a massive debris field and emergency auxiliary modules with them. Hitched to the blind spots of the flagship's lower hull are 3 heavy-duty stuff pods. John's eyes narrowed. Stuff pods. It was a lower-tier dockworker slang for the massive, unmanifested, lead-line cargo containers typically used to haul toxic industrial slag or deep space waste out of the system. They were heavily shielded to prevent radiation leaks, which meant they were entirely impenetrable to standard biological and life sign scanners. They aren't filled with slag, the leader confirmed, anticipating John's thought. They are filled with our people, a specialized team of off-world rebels, heavily armed and carrying the decryptor keys needed to interface with the sleeper device you planted yesterday. They have been riding in the freezing dark of those stuff pods for weeks, bypassing the system's outer perimeter blockades by hiding in the shadow of the military's own crippled flagship. John felt a cold chill run down his spine, completely independent of the damp chill in the reservoir. The scale of the operation was staggering. They weren't just causing a minor disruption anymore. They were actively importing an invasion force under the governor's nose. When the fleet docks, the figure continued, the automated loading cranes will detach the stuff pods and drop them down the central freight shafts into the lower tire processing bays to be incinerated or crushed. That is where you come in. The leader raised a static blurred arm, pointing directly at John's chest. You are going to lead a ground team, the synthesized voice commanded. We have selected a squad of 12 local rebel sympathizers, heavy lifters, plasma cutters, and dock rats who know the freight shafts better than the automated systems do. You will position your team at the bottom of the central freight chute in Sector 7. When those stuff pods drop, you will have exactly 4 minutes to intercept them, cut through the lead line bulkheads, and extract the off-worlders before the automated crushers engage and flatten the pods into scrap metal. John's jaw tightened. Sector 7 freight chute. It was a massive, lethal environment filled with crushing hydraulic plates and incinerator vents. If his timing was off by even a few seconds, the off-worlders would be crushed into a cube of bloody steel, and his entire ground team would be trapped in the processing grid. Once you pull them out of the pods, the second figure added, you will guide them through the maintenance arteries directly to the security perimeter junction where you planted the module. The off-worlders will activate the sleeper code, unlock the target vault, and initiate the primary assault. You are the bridge, John. Without you, the off-worlders die in the crushers, and the vault remains sealed. John stared into the swirling vortex of static that served as the leader's face. He thought of his wife, her hands swollen and her eyes bloodshot from endless hours on the textile lines. He thought of Adam, brilliant and entirely alone, piecing his education together from scraps in the dark, forced to navigate a toxic, rusted cage just to survive. The weight of his family's suffering pressed against his ribs like a physical weight, hardening his resolve into unbreakable iron. I need the exact drop schedule for the pods, John said, his voice dropping into a low, deadly register, and I need the manifest of the ground team you've assigned to me. I won't take anyone who hesitates. You will have the data packet transferred to your secure terminal by morning, the leader said. Gather your people quietly, ensure their tools are charged and their plasma cutters are hot. In 5 days, when the sky fills with broken warships and the governor is looking up, we tear the foundation out from under him. The 6 figures did not offer handshakes or parting pleasantries. Their mission delivered. They turned in perfect synchronization and began to glide back toward the pitch-black tunnel from which they had emerged. The localized distortion fields warped the shadows around them, their forms stretching and fragmenting until the high-frequency hum faded into the oppressive roar of the distant plasma forges. John stood alone once more in the center of the rusted coolant reservoir. The air felt heavier now, charged with the electric anticipation of the coming storm. He reached into his pocket, his calloused fingers brushing against a small, carved wooden token he had made for Adam years ago. He gripped it tightly. 5 days. 5 days until the stuff pods dropped. 5 days until the off-worlders hit the ground. 5 days until the invisible cuts they had inflicted on the planetary machine finally bled it dry. John turned away from the shadows, stepping back toward the loud, blinding reality of the industrial levels. He had a shift to finish, a team to assemble, and a revolution to ignite. Chapter 4. The alarm inside John's skull did not ring. It vibrated through the rusted steel frame of his thin cot, sending a dull tremor through his shoulder blades. He sat up slowly, his lungs instantly protesting against the cold, sulfur-tainted air of the lower residential block. His joints popped like dry twigs. Every muscle in his 6-foot frame burned from 15 hours spent on the welding lines. But physical pain was an old companion. Today was arrival day, and pain was the only proof he was still alive to see it. He sat on the edge of the cot for a long moment, resting his elbows on his knees and staring down at his thick, calloused hands. His knuckles were permanently scarred, laced with wide ridges where plasma arcs had bitten into his flesh over the years. In the dim amber glow of the emergency panel outside his doorway, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small piece of synthetic hardwood he had carved 3 years ago. It was smooth, worn polished by years of nervous friction. His thoughts drifted immediately to Adam. In the quiet darkness before the arcology woke to its brutal daily quota, John allowed himself to be a father. He thought of the boy's eyes, bright and endlessly curious, buried beneath a mop of unruly hair. Adam was a prodigy born in a scrap heap, while other kids in the lower tiers spent their days dodging security sweeps or running errands for black market fixers. Adam spent his hours in a sealed off, abandoned residential unit, quietly coaxing life out of dead technology. John remembered the week Adam turned 11, when the boy had managed to bypass a burnt-out optical array on a discarded medical datapad using nothing more than copper thread and a scrap battery. Adam didn't just fix machines. He understood their anatomy, feeling their pulse the way a surgeon felt a heartbeat. John closed his fist tightly around the carved token. A lump formed in his throat, heavy and cold. He loved the boy with a fierce, protective desperation that terrified him far more than Frederick's enforcers ever could. Adam had a mind that belonged in the high-tire research sanctums, not in the toxic smog of the plasma foundries. John knew the odds of surviving what was to come today were razor-thin. If his blood had to grease the gears of this revolution, so be it. But his soul burned with a single, consuming prayer, that Adam would grow up strong enough to navigate the bloodthirsty politics of this arcology, intelligent enough to outthink the tyrants, and brave enough to shield his mother when John was no longer there to stand between them and the dark. John stood up, tucked the wooden token into his inner lining, and pulled his heavy, reinforced work jacket over his broad shoulders. He took a deep breath of the stale air, shoved his fears into the darkest corner of his mind, and stepped out into the corridor. High above the industrial bowels of Sector 7, 300 kilometers into the cold void of space, Sierra Alpha 1 hung like a malignant scab against the black expanse of the universe. From orbit, the planet did not look like a world. It looked like an abandoned slag heap left to rot by a forgotten god. Vast, grease-stained cloud decks of copper-colored smog wrapped around its middle, punctuated only by the jagged, miles-high spires of the central arcology. The structure thrust upward through the toxic atmosphere, a colossal iron needle coated in decades of carbon soot, industrial grime, and frozen chemical runoff. Below the clouds, the surface was a barren wasteland of shattered bedrock and dry ocean beds, pitted with millions of tons of dumped scrap metal from centuries of strip mining. Suddenly, the void above the arcology rippled. Space tore open with a violent flash of pale blue radiation as 5 massive silhouettes limped out of quantum transit. Sector General Franklin's flagship, the ironclad dreadnought Vanguard, led the ragged procession. It was a terrifying testament to modern naval combat. The left flank of the cruiser was completely sheared open, exposing darkened crew decks and melted structural ribs to the vacuum. White plumes of frozen maneuvering gas hissed from ruptured conduits, floating like ghost shrouds around the hull. Great black scorch marks streaked across its heavy armor plating where rebel plasma torps had stripped away entire weapon batteries. Behind the flagship, 4 escort corvettes drifted on auxiliary thrusters, their hull plates warped and bubbling from extreme thermal stress, dragging a trail of shattered orbital debris behind them like a wake of broken bones. The fleet did not enter orbit with grace. It plummeted toward the upper docking rings like a falling mountain, thrusters firing out of sequence to arrest its deadly momentum. Down in the pristine, sunlit sanctum of the highest tier, Governor Frederick stood before a 40-foot holographic viewport, sweating profusely through his elaborate velvet robes. His 400-pound frame trembled with an intoxicating mixture of rage and sheer, unadulterated terror. Sweat dripped from his multiple chins, staining his embroidered collar as he stared at the damaged warships clogging his skies. "Where are the components?" Frederick roared, his voice cracking into an ear-splitting shriek that echoed off the polished marble walls. He spun around, pointing a thick, jewel-encrusted finger at a row of shuddering administrative aides and military officers kneeling on the floor. "He wants quantum core regulators, magnetic harness plates. Do you know what Franklin will do to me if those dry docks aren't operational when his boots hit my platform?" "Governor, please," a senior logistics officer stammered, staring at the floor, his hands shaking violently. The lower-tier foundry's manufacturing efficiency dropped 1% last month. The specialized alloy shipments were delayed in Sector 7. "I don't want excuses. I want heads," Frederick screamed, stepping forward and kicking a gilded hollow terminal, sending it shattering across the marble floor. "You are sabotaging me, all of you, the council, the warehouse directors, the dock managers. You're plotting with the lower-tier filth to make me look incompetent." His tiny, dark eyes bulged with paranoia. He paced back and forth like a caged beast, his heavy breathing sounding like a broken bellows. "I want mass arrests. Lock down Sector 4. Arrest every third labor supervisor on the smelting decks. Put the council members in security collars. If I don't have those quantum drives ready in 5 days, I will line every single one of you up on the clean air plateaus and let the execution drones clean the floor with you." He didn't know who was to blame. He had no names, no targets, no hard evidence. His mind, broken by decades of absolute power and sudden, impending doom, could only lash out in every direction at once. He rained down furious threats of total liquidation, completely unaware that his frantic, irrational demands were driving his own security grid into absolute chaos, precisely as the rebellion had planned. While Frederick raged in the clouds, John was moving through the dark. 2,000 levels below the executive suites, deep in the dripping, sound-insulated maintenance conduits of Sector 7, John stood before 12 men and women. They were heavy lifters, dock rats, and plasma torch operators from the lower base. They wore grease-stained work overalls and held industrial tools like weapons. Their eyes were wide, white, and terrified, reflecting the dim red light of the emergency conduits. "Listen to me," John rumbled, his voice low and steady as an engine block. "Upper deck security is looking at the sky. Frederick is screaming at his own shadows. This is our only window. We get in, we clear the chute, we get out. Nobody panics. Nobody operates off schedule." He turned and led the squad into the central incinerator access shaft. The air here was suffocatingly hot, carrying the metallic stench of superheated iron and burnt oil. Far above them, the massive central freight shaft stretched upward like a hollow mountain, running all the way to the orbital docking ring. At the very bottom sat the Sector 7 incinerator bay, a nightmare realm of automated hydraulic crushers and high-powered plasma evaporators designed to vaporize millions of tons of industrial slag. They ran into their first speed bump 50 meters from the primary access hatch. A sudden, sharp klaxon blared overhead, flashing a harsh amber light across the metal walls. An automated blast door slid down with a deafening bang, slamming into the concrete floor and sealing the corridor shut. "Security suite," one of the young dock rats gasped, his voice rising in panic as he backed away. "They saw us. The drones are coming." "Shut up," John barked, stepping up to the sealed door. He shoved the kid aside and slammed his thick palm against the manual override panel. The housing was locked with an old industrial keyway. Without hesitating, John jammed a heavy steel pry bar into the seam, leaning his entire body weight into the lever. The metal groaned, sparks flying into his face as the internal locking pins sheared off. "Stephen, grab the secondary conduit cables," John ordered, sweat pouring down his forehead as his boot slipped on the oily floor. The automated system triggered a heat bleed lockdown because the upper dry docks are venting coolant. "It's not a drone sweep, it's an atmospheric valve dump. We have 2 minutes before superheated steam fills this hall." Stephen, a former military officer serving a penal sentence in the foundries, moved instantly. He shoved a heavy copper bypass rod into the exposed wiring panel, forcing the high-voltage leads together. A bright blue electrical arc erupted with a violent snap, scorching the sleeves of John's jacket and burning the smell of ozone into the air. With a mechanical groan, the blast door shivered and rose 10 inches, just enough for a man to crawl through. Go, go, through the gap, John yelled, shoving the 12 workers through the narrow opening one by one. The air behind them was already shimmering with heat as the emergency steam vents opened up the conduit behind them. John squeezed through last, rolling onto the cold steel grating of the main freight chute just as a wall of roaring white steam slammed into the sealed blast door behind them. They were inside the incinerator bay. Above them, deep within the dark abyss of the central freight shaft, a sound like distant thunder began to roll down the iron walls. Orbital cranes have released, Stephen whispered, looking up into the darkness. The pods are dropping. The sound grew from a rumble to a deafening, terrifying screech of metal tearing against metal. 3 colossal, lead-lined stuffed pods, each the size of a 2-story residential block, were plunging down the central shaft, gravity pulling them at terminal velocity toward the Sector 7 processing bay. They were designed to be caught by automated magnetic arresters, stabilized for 3 minutes, and then tipped directly into the grinding hydraulic crushers below. Positions, John roared, his voice cutting through the rising thunder. Get the plasma torches hot. We have 4 minutes from the moment those pods hit the gantry. The 12 local workers scrambled across the narrow catwalks, their knuckles white as they gripped heavy, pneumatic cutting rigs. Their faces were pale, bathed in the blinding orange light of the plasma core glowing beneath the floorboards. A second later, the world ended in noise. The first stuffed pod slammed into the magnetic deceleration cradle with an impact that shook the entire sector. A shockwave of rust, dust, and compressed air slammed into John's chest, nearly knocking him off the catwalk. The second and third pods crashed down a fraction of a second later, locking into the heavy steel gantry with a bone-shattering metallic crunch. Instantly, overhead timers on the wall flashed to life in bright red digital numbers. 359, 358, 357. Cut them out, John screamed. The 12 workers leaped onto the steaming, black surfaces of the lead-lined containers. Bright white plasma arcs sputtered to life, spraying fountains of liquid steel across the bay. The smell of burning lead and scorched synthetic rubber filled the air. John worked alongside them, his massive muscles straining as he dragged a heavy cutting torch across the primary latch assembly of the central pod. The heat was immense, baking his face and crisping his hair, but he didn't blink. 3 minutes. The outer hull plate of the central pod groaned under the heat. Stephen and 3 dock rats jammed heavy hydraulic wedges into the glowing red seam, pumping the manual levers with frantic speed. 2 minutes. It's yielding, Stephen shouted. Pull. With a loud, tearing screech, a 10-foot section of heavy armor plate fell away from the side of the pod, crashing onto the catwalk. Thick clouds of freezing white stasis fog poured out of the dark interior, spilling over the catwalk and falling into the glowing plasma pits below. The local workers cheered, stepping forward with crowbars and emergency lights to haul the off-worlders out. Then, every single one of them froze dead in their tracks. The cheer died in their throats, replaced instantly by an absolute, suffocating terror that made the air feel 20 degrees colder. Out of the freezing fog inside the pod, a shape moved. It did not move like a human being. There was no stumble, no hesitation, no adjusting to the light. A figure stepped out onto the catwalk with a silent, fluid, mechanical precision that defied natural biology. It was clad head to toe in a seamless, matte black composite carapace that absorbed the ambient orange light of the foundry. There were no seams, no straps, no tactical pouches. The suit looked less like armor and more like a synthetic skin engineered for violence. Where a face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless black visor, a void that reflected nothing. 4 more identical figures stepped out right behind the first, moving in perfect, terrifying synchronization. 5 monolithic entities, identical in height, identical in girth, identical in posture. They radiated an aura of cold, emotionless menace so intense that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. One of the young dock rats let out a strangled gasp, dropping his plasma torch. It clattered loudly against the iron floor grating. The 12 local rebels backed away slowly, their hands shaking violently as they reached for their improvised weapons. Their hard monitors, if they had been wearing them, would have been screaming. They weren't looking at freedom fighters. They felt like they were looking at imperial executioners, synthetic, hyper-aggressive killing machines that had been sent to liquidate every living soul in the room. Back up, get back, one of the lifters stammered, his eyes wide with sheer panic as he raised a heavy iron pipe. They're not human. Look at them, they're not human. The lead figure of the 5 turned its featureless visor toward the trembling worker. The movement was instant, locked on, and dead silent. The atmosphere in the bay snapped so taut it felt as if a single spark would detonate the air. John stepped directly between his trembling crew and the 5 black armored figures. Sweat was dripping off his chin, his chest heaving as the overhead timer flashed red. 042, 041, 040. He looked into the black void of the lead operative's visor. He could feel the hyper-aggressive threat aura pulsing off the squad. The deliberate, terrifying projection of absolute power meant to make every living creature in this galaxy bow down out of sheer survival instinct. Unit 07, John said, his deep voice heavy, steady, and unyielding against the roar of the machinery below. Welcome to the junk pile. The lead figure did not speak. It simply held John's gaze for 2 agonizing seconds as the hydraulic crushers above them began their heavy, automated descent. The digital display above the crushing mechanism flashed in brutal crimson. 039, 038, 037. The air in the Sector 7 incinerator bay was so hot it scorched the back of John's throat with every breath. Yet his 11 surviving dock workers stood frozen, paralyzed by a cold, primal terror. They did not see allies standing before them. They saw 5 faceless, matte black reapers wrapped in composite armor that absorbed the orange glare of the plasma pits below. To a dock rat who had spent his entire life cowering from Governor Frederick's low-tier enforcement droids, Unit 07 looked like the ultimate evolution of Imperial violence. Lower the iron, Marcus, John said quietly, stepping further into the gap between his crew and the 5 black armored figures. His deep, gravelly voice was low, devoid of panic, vibrating with a steady, paternal authority that instantly cut through the roaring hiss of the superheated steam vents. Marcus, a 20-year-old heavy lifter whose hands were shaking so violently his iron pry bar clattered against his belt buckle, swallowed hard. John, look at them. They ain't human. They came out of a stasis pod built for toxic slag. If they pull weapons on us, they are on our side, John interrupted, turning his head just enough to catch Marcus's wide, bloodshot eyes in his peripheral vision. Look at how they stand. Look at their posture. They aren't aiming at your chest, Marcus. They're covering the access hatches. They're covering us. John took a slow, deliberate breath, letting his own broad, 6-foot frame act as a wall between his terrified men and the off-worlders. In the dark, oil-slicked underbelly of the junk pile, John had learned long ago that fear was a disease that killed faster than a plasma bolt. If his team panicked now, they would fumble the retreat, trigger the thermal sensors, and end up smashed into bloody cubes beneath the descending hydraulic plates. I taught my boy a dumb rule the day he was old enough to hold a wrench, John said, his voice carrying over the mechanical screech of the gantry. His mind flashed briefly to the quiet face of his son, sitting in that sealed-off room miles above, surrounded by wireframes and dead circuit boards. The thought of a dumb was an anchor in his chest, heavy and unbroken. I told him, respect and gratitude. You respect people for who they are, and you show gratitude for what they've done for you, and in return, you demand they respect who you are, and show gratitude for what you bring to the table. John turned fully back to face the 5 identical, featureless visors of Unit 07. Sweat rolled off his brow, stinging his eyes, but his gaze remained rock solid. These people rode in the freezing dark of a slag container for 3 weeks, wrapped in lead shielding that would have melted their organs if the seals cracked by half a millimeter. John continued, speaking as much to his men as he was to the black armored squad. They did that to bring us the keys to our freedom. That deserves our gratitude. And who they are right now, they're the only thing standing between us and an early grave. So lower your tools, pick up the gear, and get ready to move. Marcus's chest heaved. He looked at John, then at the towering, silent forms of 07, and slowly lowered his iron bar. One by one, the other 10 workers let out long, shuddering exhales, the acute paralysis breaking under the weight of John's unshakable resolve. A flat, synthetic voice suddenly echoed from the central operative of 07. It did not sound like a human voice filtered through a radio, nor did it carry the mechanical raspy metallic undertone of standard Imperial security droids. It was completely flat, devoid of pitch, gender, accent, or emotion, an identical, manufactured frequency that sounded as if it were being generated by an audio synthesizer operating at absolute zero. Unit 1 to local asset, the central operative stated. The vocal array on the helmet did not light up. The sound simply emitted from the chest plate in a focused directional beam. Incinerator cycle engagement in 22 seconds. Led the way to the security perimeter junction. The figure to Unit 1's left shifted its weight with an eerie, frictionless grace, its featureless visor sweeping the upper catwalks. Unit 2 reporting perimeter clear of biological signatures. Automated defense grid in Sector 7 remains suppressed by sleeper code. Unit 3, Unit 4, Unit 5, Unit 1 commanded, its voice identical to the others, making it impossible to tell which operative was speaking without watching the subtle micro-adjustments of their shoulders. Form rear guard, protect local assets, move. John's eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the squad transition into a tactical wedge formation around his 11 workers. There was an inhuman, terrifying perfection to their movement. Every footstep landed in dead silence, even on the grated iron floor. Their weapons, sleek, matte black carbines without external sights or tactical lights, were held at a precise 45-degree angle, tracking the dark corners of the ceiling with synchronized fluid sweeps. John had spent 20 years navigating the underground networks of Sierra Alpha 1, rubbing shoulders with black market arms dealers, deserting military officers, and radical cell leaders. He had heard the urban legends whispered over stale synthvale in the lowest, darkest taverns of the arcology, rumors that somewhere out in the deep black, beyond the 50 administrative sectors controlled by the homeworld, there existed an shadow organization, an elite, phantom army dedicated to tearing down the tyrannical regimes of the central sectors from the inside out. Seeing 07 in motion, John knew those whispers were not legends. The technology built into those seamless suits, the specialized dampening fields that erased the sound of their footfalls, the absolute erasure of individual identity. This was not the work of a localized planetary rebellion. This was the razor tip of a massive, galactic spear. Governor Frederick and Sector General Franklin sat in their pristine upper-tier sanctuaries believing they were fighting a disorganized mob of starving dock workers and scrap scavengers. They had no idea that a monster was crawling up through their floorboards. Follow me, John rumbled, turning toward the narrow maintenance conduit behind the incinerator control room. And keep your heads down. The hydraulic plates drop at 0. 003, 002, 001, 000 hours. Behind them, a sound like a mountain collapsing shattered the air. The colossal steel crusher slammed down onto the empty stuffed pots with a violent, air-compressing thud that rattled John's teeth inside his skull. A wave of pulverized lead dust and superheated air shot down the conduit, stinging their backs as they plunged into the dark, narrow service tunnels of Sector 7. John led the pack, his massive shoulders scraping against the rusted, sweat-slicked walls of the conduit. His chest burned with a deep, tearing pain that had been building since his 15-hour shift began, but he ignored it. Every step he took was calculated. He knew every turn, every rusted valve, every blind spot in the Arcology's automated security grid. He had mapped these tunnels in his head for 5 years, preparing for this exact day. As they jogged through the subterranean darkness, the low, rhythmic thrum of the Arcology's heavy plasma foundries echoing through the rock above them, John's mind kept pulling him away from the damp metal walls. It pulled him back to his small, cramped living unit in the lower residential tier, back to his wife's tired, beautiful smile, and back to Adam. He remembered the day he had given Adam that small piece of carved hardwood he still carried in his pocket. Adam had been 8 years old, his hands filthy with grease after spending 5 hours trying to fix a broken water filtration pump for their elderly neighbor. The boy had been frustrated, tears streaking through the dirt on his cheeks because the rusted fittings kept cracking under his wrench. "Why do I have to fix it, Dad?" little Adam had asked, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "Mr. Henderson doesn't have any credits to pay us. He's just an old man who sits in the hallway." John remembered kneeling down on the cold concrete floor, taking the boy's tiny, grease-stained hands in his own massive, scarred palms. "We don't do it for credits, son," John had told him, looking deep into the boy's wide, amber eyes. "We do it because Mr. Henderson worked 40 years in the smelting pit so people like us could have air to breathe. That's called respect, Adam. You respect what he gave up for this floor, and when you fix his pump, he shows gratitude by sharing his bread with your mother. That's how human beings stay human down here. The moment we stop showing respect and gratitude to each other, Governor Frederick wins. The machine wins." John wiped a mixture of sweat and grease from his eyes as he rounded a sharp corner in the conduit. "I hope you remember that, boy," John thought, his heart aching with a fierce, suffocating love. "I hope you remember every word when the sky turns to fire." "Hold, Unit 1's cold," synthetic voice sliced through John's memory. John instantly raised his hand, halting the line of workers behind him. They were standing at the threshold of a massive, circular junction vault. The air here was noticeably colder, carrying the sharp, chemical tang of high-voltage insulation and ozone. This was the primary security perimeter junction for Sector 7, a heavily armored hub that routed power, data, and security feeds between the lower industrial levels and the central vault deep within the rock face. In the center of the room sat the primary data terminal, a massive, cylindrical column of reinforced steel covered in glowing optical conduits and heavy locking clamps. It was the exact terminal where John had risked his life 36 hours ago to plant the sleeper device. Target identified. Unit 2 reported its featureless visor locked onto the terminal. Sleeper device status, dormant. System integrity at 98%. Unit 1 stepped forward, pulling a compact, silver interface module from a concealed housing in its forearm armor, deploying off-world decryption key. Time to override, 2 minutes, 30 seconds. "Make it quick," Stephen murmured, stepping up beside John, his hand resting on a heavy plasma torch strapped to his hip. The automated sweep routines in this sector reset every 3 minutes. If the main server detects a high-bandwidth data transfer coming from a low-tier terminal, it's going to trigger a hard lockdown. Unit 1 did not respond. It simply jammed the silver module directly into the core junction port. Instantly, the glowing blue optical lines covering the terminal turned a harsh, frantic purple. High-speed streams of encrypted code began cascading down the terminal's diagnostic screens, illuminating the dark junction room in a pulsing, unnatural light. For 60 seconds, the room was silent save for the hum of the data transfer. John stood near the entrance archway, his eyes scanning the dark conduits above them. His instincts, sharpened by decades of survival in the industrial depths, were screaming that something was wrong. The air felt too still. The ambient hum of the sector's cooling fans had subtly shifted frequency. "Unit 3, John said, turning his head toward the black armored operative standing near the left tunnel. "Check the primary relay line overhead. Is the power draw normal?" Before Unit 3 could adjust its visor, a deafening, high-pitched screech shattered the silence of the vault. Red emergency strobes erupted across the ceiling, drowning the room in blood-colored light. From the heavy steel archways above the 4 entry tunnels, thick blast shields began sliding down with a violent, pneumatic hiss. "Warning, an automated, synthesized female voice echoed from the ceiling speakers. Unusual data transfer detected on primary junction 7 Alpha. Counter-intrusion protocol engaged. Hard lockdown initiated. Automated defensive sweep deploying in 30 seconds. "Damn it," Marcus yelled, lunging toward the exit tunnel as a massive steel blast door slammed shut, sealing off their retreat. The system caught the key. "The key is working," Unit 1 stated flatly, its hands remaining perfectly still on the interface module as the purple code cascaded faster across the screens. "Decryption progress, 40%. Override cannot be interrupted. If the module is removed prior to completion, the sleeper code will be permanently purged from the primary data bus." "We can't stay in here," Steven shouted, drawing his plasma torch as a heavy metallic grinding noise began echoing from the ventilation shafts above. "Those are automated defense turrets in the ceiling. Once those hatches open, they'll fill this room with high-frequency laser fire. There's no cover in here." John looked at the terminal. The decryption timer on the silver module was counting down. 120, 119, 118. He looked at his 11 men, huddled together in the center of the room, their eyes wide with panic. He looked at Steven, his loyal friend who had sacrificed his own freedom to help build this resistance. Then he looked toward the northern blast door, the door that led directly to the central vault where the atomic integrator was supposed to be resting. The blast door was descending rapidly, its heavy steel teeth just 2 feet from slamming into the concrete floor. If that door sealed completely, the electronic locks would engage, trapping them in the junction room to be shredded by the automated turrets, and the vault would remain sealed forever. "Steven," John said. His voice was no longer loud, it was soft, clear, and absolute. Steven turned, looking at John. The color drained from Steven's face as he saw the expression in John's eyes. "John, no, don't look at me like that. We move together." "The blast door's override mechanism is on the outside of the frame," John said, stepping toward the descending steel door. "The main breaker is jammed under the primary hydraulic track. Someone has to lift the manual release lever and hold the high-voltage bypass cables together from the outside so the door stays open while the decryption finishes." "John, the high-voltage line will burn you alive," Steven yelled, lunging forward to grab John's arm. "We can find another way. Unit 07 can cut through the door." "Unit 07 needs every second to finish the decryption," John barked, shoving Steven back with a single, powerful push that sent the younger man staggering. "If they stop now, the sleeper code dies. The off-worlders die. Everything we built for 5 years disappears." John turned and looked at the 5 black armored figures of Unit 07. For the first time, Unit 1 paused, its featureless black visor tilting slightly toward John. "Local asset John," Unit 1 stated, its synthetic voice remaining eerie and flat despite the red strobes flashing around them. "Manual override of the secondary blast shield requires sustained physical contact with exposed 440-volt conduit lines. Biological survival probability is 0%. John offered a small, tired smile. The fear that had been lingering in the corners of his mind for weeks suddenly evaporated, replaced by a profound, serene clarity. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was a father, and his work was almost done. "Tell my son," John said, looking directly into the black void of Unit 1's visor, "that his father kept his word. Tell him to respect who he is, and never stop showing gratitude to the people who fight beside him." Without waiting for a response, John dropped to his knees and slid his massive 6-foot frame under the descending edge of the heavy steel blast door, tumbling out into the outer corridor just as the door slammed down to within 3 inches of the floor. "John," Steven's voice screamed from the other side of the steel plate, muffled and desperate. Outside in the outer corridor, the automated defense grid was already waking up. 2 heavy, dual-barrel plasma turrets dropped from the ceiling hatches 30 feet away, their targeting lasers painting bright red crosses across John's chest. John didn't look at the turrets. He scrambled to his feet, lunging toward the open high-voltage junction box mounted beside the blast door. The heavy copper bypass cables were thick, frayed, and humming with lethal energy. "For a dumb," John whispered, his hands steady as iron. He grabbed the 2 raw, exposed high-voltage cables with his bare, calloused hands and slammed them together against the manual override terminal. A blinding, violent blue explosion of electrical energy erupted instantly. Thousands of volts of raw industrial current surged through John's hands, shooting up his arms and tearing through his nervous system. His body seized violently, his muscles locking into absolute rigidity as the smell of burning flesh and scorched fabric filled the narrow corridor. The electric shock was an agonizing inferno that tore through every cell in his body, but John did not let go. His fingers, fused to the copper wires by the extreme heat, held the circuit tight. With a loud pneumatic groan, the heavy steel blast door shuddered, locked in place 3 inches above the floor, refusing to seal shut. "Hold it," John's mind screamed through the blinding white pain that consumed his vision. "Hold it for the boy. Hold it for the revolution." The dual plasma turrets down the hall locked onto his standing silhouette. A volley of superheated blue plasma bolts erupted from the barrels, tearing through the air and slamming into John's chest and shoulders. The impact tore through his heavy work jacket, cauterizing his flesh and knocking the breath from his lungs. But his locked, electrical muscle spasms kept his hands clamped onto the high-voltage wires. He stood like an iron colossus in the center of the corridor, taking the full brunt of the automated system's fury, refusing to fall. Inside the junction room, the silver interface module on the central terminal chimed with a clear, high-pitched tone. "Decryption complete," Unit 1 announced flatly, pulling the module from the port. "Primary vault security overridden. Sleeper code active." The heavy vault doors at the far end of the room hissed open, breaking a seal that had remained untouched for 25 years. Steven and the 11 workers scrambled under the jammed blast door, rushing out into the corridor. Steven caught John's collapsing body as the high-voltage circuit finally shorted out, showering the hall in dying sparks. The plasma turrets above clicked off, their targeting systems cleared as the sleeper code flooded the sector's mainframe. Steven fell to his knees on the cold floor, cradling John's upper body in his arms. John's chest was ruined, his hands charred black, his breathing a shallow, wet rattle, yet his eyes were open, staring up through the dim red emergency lights toward the ceiling. John, hold on, brother, Stephen sobbed, his hands covered in soot as he pressed against John's chest. We got it open. The vault is open. John's trembling, blackened right hand moved slightly, his fingers weakly brushing against the inner pocket of his jacket where the small carved wooden token rested. He couldn't speak. His throat was scorched, his lungs failing, but as he looked up into Stephen's weeping face, a faint, peaceful warmth settled behind his eyes. He didn't see the dark, grease-stained walls of Sector 7 anymore. In his mind, he saw a dome. He saw his son standing on the sunlit upper plateaus of a free world, holding his mother's hand, looking up at a clean blue sky that had never known the smog of Governor Frederick's foundries. He saw a boy who would grow into a strong, righteous man, a man built on respect, built on gratitude, built on the unbreakable foundation his father had laid with his final breath. Unit 1 stepped through the jammed blast door, its matte black suit pristine, its featureless visor looking down at the dying man. Local asset John, Unit 1's cold, identical voice echoed through the quiet corridor. Your mission objective has been achieved. John's chest gave one final, slow rise, and then sank still. The harsh, rhythmic thrum of the Arcology's plasma foundries echoed through the rock around them. But for John, the noise finally faded into absolute, beautiful silence. Chapter 5. The silence that followed John's final, shuddering breath was heavier than the steel blast doors hanging above them. Stephen remained on his knees in the slick oil and scorched suit of the corridor, his large, scarred hands cupped beneath John's neck. The heat from the plasma burns on John's chest was still radiating into the damp air, carrying the sickening, sweet stench of charred flesh and burnt synthetic insulation. Stephen did not look up. His eyes were fixed on John's face, on the quiet, unnatural stillness that had settled over features that had spent 50 years carved in perpetual, stubborn endurance. Around them, the red emergency strobes of the junction vault continued to rotate in silent, rhythmic sweeps, bathing the concrete walls in a slow, blood-red pulse. 10 feet away, the 5 operatives of Unit 07 stood like obsidian statues carved directly into the shadows. Their matte black composite suits showed not a single scratch, not a smudge of grease, not a flicker of heat. They did not shift their weight. They did not sigh. They did not offer the quick, muttered prayers that human soldiers gave to the dead. They simply existed in a terrifying, mechanical vacuum, their featureless visors pointed into the gloom of the open vault corridor. Behind Stephen, the remaining 10 dock workers were breaking apart. The thread of collective purpose that John had spun out of sheer willpower had snapped the second his heart stopped beating. He's dead, a worker named Guard whispered, his voice cracking as he stumbled backward, dropping his pneumatic cutting rig onto the iron floor grating. The heavy steel tool clattered with a hollow, echoing sound that made everyone flinch. John's dead. Look at him. His hands are melted to the wires. He's dead. Shut your mouth, Guard, Stephen growled without turning around, his voice raw, thick with smoke and suppressed grief. Get your gear up. The sweet grid is down, but it won't stay down forever. For what? Another worker, a lean, nervous crane operator named Dax, screamed back. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, popping out of a face caked in black grease and sweat. He waved a wildly trembling hand toward the silent figures of 07. Look at these things, Stephen. They aren't rebels. They aren't even people. We just watched John burn himself to ashes for a bunch of silent executioners and an empty corridor. I didn't sign up for this. None of us signed up to be butcher meat in a hole. We signed up to break the sector, Stephen snapped, slowly laying John's head down onto the cold metal grating. He stood up, his massive frame hunched, his knuckles wide as he turned to face the terrified men. John gave you a path out of the foundries. You honor that path by moving forward. Screw his path, Guard yelled, backing away toward the dark, unmapped ventilation conduit that led west, away from the central vault. John's dead, and you're just a broken military relic who doesn't know when to quit. I'm going back to the lower tiers. I'll take my chances in the smelting base before I follow those black ghosts another inch. Guard, don't you dare step into that dark, Stephen shouted, taking a heavy step toward him. That tunnel isn't cleared. If you run now. I'm done, Guard screamed. He turned his back on Stephen, grabbing Dax by the shoulder. Come on, Dax, we're getting out of here before the droids recover. The two men bolted into the pitch-black mouth of the western conduit, their heavy work boots pounding a frantic, uneven rhythm against the iron floorboards. They made it 5 paces. Without a single word, without a change in breath, the operative standing on the far right of the wedge, Unit 5, moved. The action was so fast it blurred the eye. In a fraction of a second, Unit 5's arm snapped upward, a heavy, unornamented sidearm clearing its magnetic thigh holster with a faint metallic click. 2 suppressed, high-density plasma blasts tore through the dark. There was no thunderous roar, only 2 violent, whip-like cracks that ionized the air into bright purple flashes. 50 feet down the tunnel, Guard and Dax didn't even have time to scream. The high-energy bolt struck them squarely between the shoulder blades, burning completely through their heavy work coats, spine, and sternum in a microsecond. Their bodies didn't fall. They collapsed forward like empty sacks of grain, slamming into the rusted floorboards with a dull, wet thud, smoke rising from the blackened holes in their backs. No, Stephen roared. Pure, unadulterated military instinct took over. 30 years of muscle memory erased every thought of tactical alignment or long-term strategy. Stephen didn't see allies. He saw a rogue squad opening fire on unarmed men. With a furious, guttural growl, Stephen lunged forward, his massive, broad shoulders lowered as he charged directly at Unit 5, intending to drive the operative into the concrete bulkhead. Unit 5 didn't flinch. It didn't step back. As Steven closed the 10-foot gap, Unit 5 simply pivoted its left foot 3 inches to the outside, raising the sidearm with a cold, terrifying economy of motion. Crack! A third suppressed plasma bolt caught Steven directly in the right shoulder. The thermal kinetic force smashed into his collarbone, spinning his heavy body around mid-charge. Steven let out a strangled bark of pain as his right arm went instantly numb, the searing heat cauterizing the flesh instantly as he slammed shoulder first onto the cold iron grating, sliding 3 feet before coming to a halt at Unit 1's boots. Steven lay on his side, his vision swimming in bright red flashes of agony. He clutched his right shoulder with his left hand, feeling the charred hole in his jacket and the slick, sticky blood oozing beneath his fingers. He gritted his teeth so hard a metallic taste filled his mouth. "You bastards," Steven spat, glaring up through the red emergency light at the featureless visor of Unit 1 standing above him. They were running. They were just scared kids. "Desertion compromises operational security," the voice emitted from Unit 1's chest plate. It was flat, unbroken, identical in frequency to the shots that had just fired. "Panic attracts automated bioscanners. Uncontrolled elements in a hot zone are a threat to mission viability. Unit 5 neutralized the breach." "We're on the same damn side," Steven wheezed, pushing himself up onto his left elbow, his body trembling from the shock of the burn. "Alignment of target objectives does not constitute operational integration," Unit 1 stated coldly, looking down at Steven with zero malice, zero regret and zero empathy. "You are local infrastructure guides. Your survival is secondary to the extraction of the asset. You will maintain discipline, or you will be neutralized to preserve stealth." The remaining 8 dock workers shrank against the wall of the junction box, their faces ghostly white, their breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The message was crystal clear. Null 7 was not a rescue squad. They were an instrument of total, uncompromising war. They held no sentiment for the lower tiers, no pity for the serfs, and no hesitation to liquidate anyone who threatened the margin of their success. Steven spat a mouthful of dark blood onto the grating. He understood the math now. He had served 30 years in the Imperial Orbital Infantries before his court-martial. He knew what cold, unyielding military logic looked like. These 5 figures were not fighting a political campaign to make people feel safe. They were operating on a terrifying, grand-scale calculus where human lives were merely fuel to be burned in exchange for an objective. Groaning through the white-hot agony in his shoulder, Steven dragged himself back across the floor until he was sitting beside John's body once more. His right arm hung uselessly at his side, twitching with nerve spasms, but he used his left hand to reach into John's scorched, bloody jacket. John had spent his final seconds trying to touch something in his inner pocket. Steven needed to know what it was. His fingers brushed against a hard, smooth object nestled near John's ribcage. Steven pulled it out, bringing it into the dim light. It was the small, carved wooden token John had carried for years. The front of the token was worn completely smooth, polished by decades of John's thumb rubbing against the grain during long, stressful shifts on the welding line. But as Steven turned the piece of wood over in his blood-stained palm, his brow furrowed in confusion. The back of the token was covered in a dense, microscopic network of etched symbols. They weren't human letters, they weren't standard Imperial military grid coordinates, nor were they the common trade runes used by the black market fixers in the lower levels. They were fine, geometric lines interlocked with tiny, precise tonal dots, a complex, mathematical language that looked less like writing and more like an orbital navigation schematic compressed into an area no larger than a coin. Steven stared at the symbols, his heavy, bruised brain struggling to make sense of them. He was a sergeant, a meathead who knew how to breach a reinforced bunker, how to strip a heavy plasma rifle in 30 seconds, and how to survive on rations that tasted like wet chalk. He had spent 30 years taking orders from arrogant young lieutenants before he finally snapped and broke an officer's jaw on a transport deck, earning himself a dishonorable discharge and a one-way ticket to Sierra Alpha 1. He knew what this planet really was. The administrative propaganda called Sierra Alpha 1 an industrial resource sector, but everyone who lived here knew the truth. It wasn't a prison. Prisons required guards, fences, and budget allocations. Sierra Alpha 1 was a galactic dumping ground. When the central governing bodies in the inner sectors had citizens, disgraced soldiers, political dissidents, or union organizers who caused too many headaches, they didn't waste credits executing them. They simply revoked their travel passes, loaded them onto cargo freighters, and dropped them into the smog-choked lower tiers of the junk pile to spend the rest of their lives smelting raw alloys until their lungs gave out. John had been different from the other trash dumped on this rock. John was a builder, and looking at this carved token, Steven realized John had been carrying a secret far deeper than anyone in Sector 7 had ever guessed. Steven closed his left fist tightly around the wooden token, shoving it deep into his own trousers pocket. Whatever this is, John, Steven thought, staring into his dead friend's quiet face, I'll get it to Adam. I swear to God I'll get it to the boy. Inside the matte black, composite helmet of Unit 1, a very different mind was evaluating the scene. Beneath the sound-dampening seals, the biomonitors, and the artificial neural link array that flattened her voice into a synthetic drone, Sanwa took a slow, measured breath. Her real lungs, shaped by the thin, high-altitude atmosphere of a world that no longer existed, expanded against the tight internal padding of the suit. To the human workers cowering in the corridor, she was a featureless, Terrifying killing machine, a manufactured stormtrooper without a name, a face, or a soul. They did not know that her original skin was a pale, iridescent blue, or that her eyes possessed twin irises designed to catch the faint light of a dying star. They did not know that the 4 operatives standing beside her, Unit 2, 3, 4, and 5, were human beings whose original faces had been systematically sliced away and rebuilt into identical, unidentifiable clones through dark, illegal back alley surgeries in the Outer Rim. She was Sanwa, the last remaining commander of the 3rd Exodus Fleet, and to her, the death in this corridor was not an atrocity, it was an excruciatingly familiar math. Humans, Sanwa thought, her neural optic overlay tracking the sharp spikes in Steven's heart rate and the rapid biodecline of the 2 dead workers down the tunnel, so fragile, so violently governed by their immediate fears. Her internal suit diagnostics flashed a quiet green query across her visor display, confirming that Unit 5's sidearm had returned to standby mode. Sanwa did not regret Unit 5's decision to execute the 2 deserting workers. In the grand, brutal geometry of their mission, a single frantic worker running into an uncleared corridor could trip a thermal tripwire, alerting Governor Frederick's security grid to their exact position. If the grid woke up before they reached the deep structural levels, all 5 members of Null 7 would be cornered and destroyed. And if Null 7 died, the secret of the atomic integrator died with them. Sanwa looked down at John's lifeless body. A faint, painful ache resonated deep within her chest cavity, an old, ancient grief that had nothing to do with the human lying on the floor. 25 years ago, her homeworld had burned for the exact same reason this arcology was currently rotting from the inside out, human greed. She remembered the day the 30 Imperial warships had appeared in the pristine blue skies above her city. She remembered how her people had welcomed the visitors, offering them bread, water, and the knowledge of the matter sequencer, a technology her ancestors had built to eliminate famine and scarcity across their entire star system. She remembered how quickly the visitors' eyes had changed. It was an instant shift, a sudden, terrifying infection of avarice. The humans didn't want to share the technology. They wanted to own it. They wanted to turn a tool of infinite creation into the ultimate weapon of cosmic dominance. When her council refused to surrender the primary operational cores, the fleet hadn't negotiated. They had simply opened their orbital bombardment bays and turned a living, breathing paradise into a silent, glass tomb. Only 50 of her people had survived, scattered across the galaxy in 10 tiny groups of 5, hiding their identities, altering their bodies, and blending into the endless human machine. And yet, Sanwa thought, her visor tracking Steven as he painfully dragged himself back toward the remaining workers, they are not all the same. She had watched John hold those high-voltage cables with his bare hands. She had watched the raw, electrical fire burn through his flesh, witnessed the plasma bolts tear through his shoulders, and watched him hold the circuit open anyway. He hadn't done it for credits. He hadn't done it for power or territory. He had done it for a boy he would never see again, and for a dream of a world where his people didn't have to live in the dark. It was a staggering, irrational display of self-sacrifice, the exact same self-sacrifice her own father had shown when he shoved her into the last stasis pod 25 years ago. Humanity is a disease created by its leaders, Sanwa thought, her voice synthesizer remaining dead silent as she processed the tactical data routing through her helmet. The rulers are monsters, but the serfs are just host bodies, crushed beneath the weight of the same iron boot that shattered my world. Unit 1, Unit 2's synthetic voice pinged on their private, encrypted neural channel, a frequency that bypassed the external speakers entirely. Local asset John is deceased. Local asset Steven is combat impaired with a 3rd-degree thermal puncture in the right deltoid. Structural integrity of the remaining local crew is compromised by 62%. Recommendation, execute remaining local assets to optimize movement speed. Sanwa paused, her twin irises narrowing behind her polarized visor as she looked at Steven. Negative, Unit 2, Sanwa responded across the private neural link, her voice inside her own helmet carrying its natural, soft melodic cadence that no human would ever hear again. The former sergeant knows the structural layout of the unmapped support levels below Sector 7. Our orbital schematics are 25 years old. The arcology has expanded downwards since the probe was launched. We need his physical knowledge to navigate the support spans. Understood. Unit 1. Unit 2 replied instantly, its neural feedback showing total compliance. Adjusting tactical parameters. Steven designated as primary local guide. Sanwa switched her communications feedback to the external chest speaker. The cold, flat, manufactured drone returned instantly. Stand up, Sergeant, Sanwa commanded, pointing her featureless visor directly at Steven. Steven wiped the blood from his mouth with his left sleeve, groaning as he pushed himself up against the concrete wall. His face was gray with pain, his right arm hanging limp, but his eyes were burning with a dark, stubborn defiance. I'm up, he rasped. Where are we going? The vault is empty, Sanwa stated flatly. Steven froze, his eyes widening. What? The primary chamber inside the vault is empty, Sanwa repeated, her synthetic voice showing no emotion, though inside her suit, her heart was beating with a cold, desperate rhythm. The pedestal shows a dust margin consistent with the removal event occurring approximately 25 years ago. The atomic integrator is no longer in Sector 7. A collective gasp went up from the 8 surviving workers. Steven felt as if someone had slammed a sledgehammer into his stomach. Empty? John died for an empty room. The device was moved, Sanwa said, turning her head toward the massive, open archway that led deeper into the subterranean foundations of the arcology. It was moved down, into the unmapped structural support sectors that lie beneath the primary levels. Someone knew what it was, and someone hid it where Governor Frederick's scanners could never reach. She stepped past Stephen, her matte black boots making no sound against the blood-stained floor grating. We move now, Sanwa said, before the security grid resets. The heavy steel door of Residential Unit 402 groaned on its rusted hinges, letting in the sharp, metallic draft of the hallway before closing with a hollow click. Adam didn't look up from his data pad immediately. His thin fingers were moving with practiced, rhythmic precision across the cracked glass screen, guiding a wireframe freighter through a simulated atmospheric re-entry. A tiny red warning light flashed in the corner of his interface. A simulated heat shield failure on thruster manifold 3. Without breaking stride, Adam rerouted the auxiliary coolant lines using a salvaged macro routine he had written last Tuesday, steadying the virtual ship just as the door latch firmly engaged. Only then did he set the pad down on his narrow cot, his heart giving a small, familiar tug as he watched his mother step into the room. She looked entirely spent. Her work overalls, stiff with dried salt and industrial grease from the lower textile belts, clung heavily to her narrow frame. Dark, bruised shadows sat deep beneath her eyes, and her light hair was pinned back in a hasty, loose knot, powdered with gray lint from the synthetic looms. She carried a small, dented tin canister under her arm, their daily ration allotment. "Hey, kiddo," she said, her voice raspy and dry from 12 hours of breathing untreated air in the lower mills. She offered him a tiny, fragile smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey, Mom," Adam replied softly, swinging his legs over the edge of the cot. He stood up and immediately walked over to the small wall-mounted basin, pumping the manual lever 4 times until a thin, rusty trickle of recycled water sputtered out. He wet a scrap of coarse gray cloth and handed it to her. It was an unspoken ritual between them, respect and gratitude, the quiet rule his father had pounded into the marrow of their home. You take care of the people who bleed for you. His mother took the cloth, pressing it to her neck with a long, shuddering sigh. "Thanks, Adam." She set the tin canister on the small, scratched metal table in the center of the room. Inside were 2 lukewarm blocks of compressed protein mash, pale green, jelly-like squares that smelled faintly of sulfur and dried kelp, and a small bulb of rehydrated starch paste. It was standard low-tire fuel, uninspired, bland, and barely enough to replace the calories burned over a shift, but it kept the hunger from turning into an ache. They sat across from each other at the small table, eating in a quiet, heavy silence that felt unusual for their cramped home. Normally, the air between them was filled with chatter, Adam babbling about a new code bridge he had patched together, or his mother telling a funny story about the clumsy logistics overseers on Line 4. Today, the air felt thick, heavy, and cold. Adam picked at his protein block with a plastic spork, his eyes shifting toward the far corner of the unit where his father's spare work boots sat neatly tucked under a shelf. They were empty. John hadn't come home after his shift ended 3 hours ago. That wasn't entirely unusual for a man working volunteer maintenance on the lower freight conduits. But today, every ambient noise in the building, the distant thrum of the lift cables, the sudden hiss of the steam pipes, the heavy footsteps in the corridor, made Adam's chest tighten with an inexplicable, sharp anxiety. He looked at his mother. Her hands were trembling slightly as she held her starch bulb. She hadn't mentioned John's absence either. It was a silent agreement between them, a desperate defense mechanism. If you don't say the fear out loud, it remains just a shadow. "Rough day on the looms," Adam asked quietly, trying to puncture the suffocating quiet. "They increased the line speed by 5%, she murmured, wiping a trace of starch from her lip. "Governor's office sent down a new quota directive this morning. Everyone's jumping at shadows." The supervisors were screaming at the floor techs before the shifts even rotated. She set her foot down, staring aimlessly at the scratched metal tabletop. "It just feels wrong today, Adam. The whole sector feels like a pipe about to burst." "Dad knows how to handle the supervisors," Adam said, his voice rising slightly, as much to convince himself as her. "He knows every blind spot in Sector 7. His mother looked up at him, her eyes softening with a sad, gentle tenderness. "I know he does, sweetheart, I know." She finished her portion slowly, clearly forcing the bland food down for strength rather than hunger. When she was done, she stood up, washed her hands in the thin trickle of the basin, and walked over to the narrow wooden cabinet set into the far wall. It was the only piece of real wood in the entire unit, salvaged by John years ago from an abandoned administrative office in the upper mid-tiers. Inside was her haven. She reached in with delicate, calloused hands and pulled out a wide, shallow metal tray. On it rested her cherished life's work, a meticulous, handcrafted miniature model of a pre-industrial farmstead. In a world made entirely of rusted steel, toxic smog, and cold concrete, her tiny farm was a miracle of quiet patience. Over 12 years, she had gathered microscopic scraps from every corner of the arcology to build it. The tiny farmhouse was built from slivers of real pine crate shavings glued together with dried resin. The fences were made from copper wire pulled from dead terminal relays, straightened and twisted into delicate rails. The little crops of wheat were crafted from frayed yellow thread scavenged from the textile mill waste bins, and the tiny soil patches were made from crushed, dried tea leaves mixed with fine iron dust. She set the tray gently on her lap as she sat back down on her cot. She pulled a tiny pair of tweezers and a needle file from her pocket, her tired face instantly softening as she leaned over the model. Adam watched her from across the room. He loved seeing her work on it. Whenever the heavy iron weight of the junk pile threatened to crush her spirit, she would sit with her tiny farm, carefully gluing another fence post or shaping a miniature water trough out of a scrap of foil. It was her escape, a quiet, stubborn protest against the cold, artificial cage they lived in, a dream of a world where soil was soft, the air smelled like rain, and children grew up under an open sky rather than a ceiling of rusted iron pipes. Is that a new barn door? Adam asked, leaning forward on his elbows. She murmured, her tweezers carefully positioning a tiny piece of shaved resin against the miniature wooden wall. Scavenged a bit of red plastic wrapper from the canteen trash. If I slice it thin enough, it looks like weathered paint. It's really cool, Mom, Adam said softly. It's coming together, kiddo, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the tiny wooden house. Just needs a little more time. She paused, her tweezers hovering in the air, her breath hitched slightly, and she slowly lowered her hands, staring at the miniature farm without seeing it. The sudden stillness in her posture brought the sharp, icy anxiety rushing right back into the room. Adam picked up his data pad again, tapping the screen to wake the display. The wireframe ship was still sitting in the digital hangar, waiting for his next command, but his fingers hovered motionless over the glass. The quiet inside Unit 402 was absolute, heavy with the terrifying, silent knowledge that somewhere far below them, in the dark, oil-slick depths of the arcology, the world had already changed forever. The heavy, pressurized blast door sealed shut behind them, cutting off the dull red emergency strobes of Sector 7. Ahead lay the absolute, suffocating void of the unmapped structural foundation. Inside Sanwa's helmet, the darkness did not exist. Her internal heads-up display booted into full tactical combat mode, transitioning seamlessly from ambient low-light amplification to active topographical mapping. A wireframe mesh of cool, electric blue instantly painted the surrounding geometry across her polarized visor. Environmental mapping. Active. Sonar paying. Interval 4 seconds. To the human workers stumbling behind her, the abyss was a terrifying wall of pitch-black nothingness, broken only by the erratic, shaking beams of their small handheld halogen flashlights. To Sanwa, the cavernous space was illuminated in stark, hyper-detailed data streams. She stood at the precipice of a colossal subterranean canyon. The scale was staggering, defying standard imperial architectural limits. Massive, cylindrical support pillars, each one measuring over 100 meters in diameter, rose out of the unseen depths like the petrified trunks of iron redwood trees, carrying the weight of the 2,000 arcology tiers above. Between them stretched a single, terrifyingly narrow maintenance gantry. It was a skeletal bridge of rusted iron grating, barely 3 meters wide, with no railings, no safety tethers, and no stabilizing cables. It spanned 400 meters across the open void to the next structural tier. Far below, echoing up through the dark, was the deafening, continuous roar of subplanetary coolant rivers crashing through the bedrock. Sanwa's HUD automatically dropped a waypoint marker on the far side of the gantry. Objective, primary support pillar Secundus. Distance, 412 meters. She shifted her gaze to the local assets. Her biometric overlay bathed Stephen and the 8 remaining dock workers in glowing thermal auras. Stephen's heat signature was a deep, bruised orange, his right shoulder radiating bright crimson where the plasma burn was slowly stiffening his muscles. Asset, Stephen, BPM, 132. Adrenaline, elevated. Status, combat impaired. The other 8 workers were washed in frantic, high-stress yellow thermal bands. Their heart rates fluttered between 150 and 170 beats per minute. Their flashlights darted wildly across the rusted grating at their feet, terrified of what lay beyond the meager 5-meter reach of their halogen bulbs. Unit 2, Unit 3, Sanwa communicated over the encrypted neural link, her natural voice soft and steady inside her mind, translated instantly into silent code. Form the vanguard with local asset Stephen. We cross first. Unit 4, Unit 5, maintain rearguard behind the local laborers. Watch their footfalls. If a local slips, let them fall. Do not compromise your center of gravity. Acknowledged. Unit 1. The synchronized neural responses chimed in her HUD, lighting up their respective squad status icons in bright, steady green. Move out, Sanwa commanded through her external chest speaker, the synthesized robotic voice cutting through the roar of the water below like a cold blade. Keep your eyes on the grating. Do not look down. Stephen swallowed hard, shifting his weight painfully. He aimed his flashlight forward, the beam catching the rusted, jagged edges of the bridge. Without a word, he stepped out over the abyss. Sanwa followed, stepping onto the gantry. Her suit's internal gyroscopes hummed, micro-adjusting her balance with frictionless perfection. Her boots locked onto the iron grating with magnetic precision. She did not need a flashlight. Her optical sensors filtered out the chaotic, sweeping beams of the human's lights, replacing them with a crisp, stabilized high-contrast overlay. The crossing was agonizingly slow. The bridge groaned and swayed beneath the weight of 14 bodies. The air grew colder, thick with aerosolized moisture from the roaring rivers 2 kilometers below. Sanwa tracked their progress on her digital minimap. Distance to waypoint, 200 meters, 150 meters, 90 meters. Stephen, Sanwa, Unit 2, and Unit 3 had just reached the solid, heavy steel plating of the far platform. They stepped off the swaying grating, establishing a secure perimeter in the dark. Still out on the bridge, strung along the last 50 meters of the span, were the 8 terrified human workers, closely followed by Unit 4 and Unit 5. Sanhua turned, her thermal vision tracking the yellow silhouettes of the workers inching their way across. Everything was mathematically sound. The threat assessment module in her HUD registered 0 active security payings. The central grid was blind down here. Then, a sudden, jarring anomaly flared in her lower peripheral vision. It was not a digital security tripwire. It was analog, a physical, tension-based monofilament line, jury-rigged into the rusted grating decades ago, entirely off the grid. The heavy, trembling boot of the third dock worker had snagged it, pulling the wire taut. Warning, kinetic trigger detected, unregistered ordnance initializing. Contact. Sanhua barked over the neural link, her combat subroutines instantly taking over her central nervous system. Before the human workers could even blink, the abyss erupted in blinding, apocalyptic fire. Hidden within the massive recesses of the adjacent support pillars, a dozen automated plasma batteries sprang to life. They were old, pre-imperial, unregulated scrap tech, patched together by forgotten smugglers or paranoid hermits from a century past. A barrage of hyper-accelerated blue plasma bolts tore out of the darkness, crisscrossing the bridge in a devastating, geometric web of crossfire. In the stroboscopic flashes of the plasma fire, the true, terrifying enormity of the chamber was suddenly revealed to the humans. For fractions of a second, the darkness was banished, exposing the gargantuan iron pillars stretching endlessly upward into the smog, and plunging downward into a bottomless gorge of jagged rock and churning, white-capped water. The scale was sanity-shattering. They were ants crawling across a thread in the belly of a mechanical god. Ambush, Stephen roared, diving behind a thick steel structural rib on the safe platform, dragging his useless right arm with him. Out on the bridge, it was an immediate slaughter. There was no cover, no structural ribs to hide behind, just 50 meters of open, rusted iron suspended in the void. Sanhua's HUD went frantic, prioritizing targets as her combat reticle snapped onto the concealed plasma battery's thread lock acquired. Firing, she raised her carbine, the weapon interfacing perfectly with her visor, and squeezed the trigger. Suppressed, high-density bolts fired back into the dark, but the angle was impossible. The turrets were recessed deep within heavy armor plating. On the bridge, the first volley of plasma struck the human workers. Sanhua's thermal overlay registered the catastrophic biological trauma in horrifying, high-definition data. The worker who had tripped the wire was hit simultaneously by 3 bolts. His thermal silhouette spiked from yellow to blinding, superheated white as the plasma vaporized his torso. His upper half simply disappeared, while his legs collapsed forward onto the grating, smoking heavily. 2 more workers, screaming in sheer panic, dropped their flashlights and turned to run back the way they came. A heavy, rapid-fire plasma repeater mounted on the lower pillar tracked their movement. A sweeping line of blue fire walked across the bridge. The kinetic impact tore through their legs, severing bone and muscle in a microsecond. They didn't even have time to register the pain before their momentum carried them over the edge. Sanhua watched their thermal signatures tumble over the side, their screams echoing wildly off the iron pillars, fading rapidly into the roar of the water below. Return fire. Suppressive patterns, Sanhua commanded over the neural link. Units 2 and 3 stepped to the edge of the platform beside her, ignoring the plasma bolts scorching the air inches from their visors. They moved with mechanical perfection, laying down a synchronized wall of covering fire into the dark. But the ancient turrets were programmed with a brutal, overlapping killbox algorithm. Another dock rat, a young kid barely out of his teens, froze in the center of the bridge, his hands clamped over his ears in pure, paralyzed terror. The strobing flashes lit up his wide, tear-streaked face biometrics. Shock state, immobilized. A heavy plasma slug caught him square in the chest. The concussive force lifted him off his feet, throwing him backward into another worker. The 2 bodies tangled, sliding across the slick, rusted iron grating until they slipped beneath the bottom wire, plunging into the abyss in a tangle of flailing limbs. The remaining 3 workers threw themselves flat against the grating, crying, praying, trying to press their bodies into the very atoms of the iron. It was useless. A secondary cluster of mortars on the far wall thudded heavily, lobbing 3 glowing thermal detonators high into the air. Sanhua's HUD tracked the parabolic arcs of the explosive's trajectory. Critical. Impact in 1.2 seconds. Unit 4, Unit 5, evasive maneuver, Sanhua screamed in her mind. The detonators landed directly on the grating amidst the huddled humans. The explosion was a blinding sphere of white-hot kinetic force. The blast utterly consumed the remaining 3 workers, turning them into a spray of ash and superheated shrapnel. The shockwave tore through the bridge, ripping a massive 10-meter section of the iron grating entirely free from its moorings. Unit 4 and Unit 5 had been advancing through the plasma fire, their matte black armor absorbing glancing blows that would have melted standard infantry plating, but they could not absorb the structural collapse of the bridge beneath their feet. As the iron grating buckled and sheared apart, Unit 4 lost his footing. The servos in his knees whined as he lunged forward, trying to grab the remaining solid edge of the bridge. A stray plasma bolt caught him directly in the right shoulder joint, severing the heavy myomer bundles that powered the arm. His grip failed. He slipped violently backward, his boots scraping uselessly against the falling steel. Unit 4, Unit 5 transmitted over the neural link. With absolute, selfless precision, Unit 5 dove forward over the collapsing gap, extending his hand to catch Unit 4's armored forearm. Their synthetic gloves locked together with a magnetic hum. For a fraction of a second, Unit 5 held his squadmate, his boots magnetically clamped to the twisted, groaning edge of the broken bridge. Then, the ancient plasma battery on the right flank recalibrated. A concentrated, sustained beam of thermal energy slammed directly into Unit 5's chest plate. The localized heat was so intense that Sanwa's HUD immediately flashed a critical armor breach warning. Unit 5, armor integrity failing. Internal temperature critical. The magnetic clamps in Unit 5's boots overheated and fused, shattering under the sheer weight of 2 heavily armored combatants. The edge of the bridge gave way completely. Sanwa stepped to the absolute lip of the platform, her hand reaching out into the empty air. Through the external audio receptors of her suit, she heard the dying human workers screaming, long, drawn-out wails of primal terror that echoed endlessly down the subterranean canyon. But from Unit 4 and Unit 5, there were no screams. As they plummeted over the edge, entangled in falling iron and smoking debris, their external speakers emitted only a sharp, mechanical burst of audio static, a localized comms dump, a final robotic glitch as their external modulators failed. But inside Sanwa's helmet, on the private neural link, it was different. She heard Unit 5's real voice, a desperate, human gasp of effort, followed by Unit 4's quiet, resigned whisper, "Clear the board. 1. Get the device." Sanwa stared down into the abyss. Her combat HUD instantly locked onto their falling thermal signatures, painting them in bright, tragic green against the pitch-black void. She watched them fall. The world around her seemed to slow down, mimicking the cold, clinical pacing of a digital simulation tracking assets. Unit 4, Unit 5, velocity, 42 meters per second, increasing, depth, 300 meters. The plasma batteries, having successfully cleared the biological targets from their kill box, abruptly powered down. The strobing flashes ceased. The colossal chamber was plunged instantly back into absolute, crushing darkness, leaving only the blue tactical wireframe in Sanwa's vision. Depth, 700 meters. Stephen dragged himself to the edge of the platform, shining his pitiful halogen light down into the dark. It illuminated nothing but mist and dust. Who went over? He gasped, his chest heaving, his face pale and slick with sweat. Did the boys make it? Sanwa did not answer. She stood perfectly still, a black statue perched on the edge of the abyss, her twin irises locked onto the telemetry scrolling across her visor. Depth, 1,200 meters. Unit 5 internal vitals, failing. She watched the 2 green icons shrink smaller and smaller on her digital map. They were falling in perfect formation, locked together in the dark, plunging toward the roaring waters 2 kilometers below. There was no panic in their descent vectors, no flailing, just the terrifying, beautiful mathematics of gravity claiming its due. Depth, 1,800 meters. Signal degradation, 85%. The roar of the subplanetary river filled the silence of the chamber, a heavy, endless bass note that vibrated through the steel platform beneath Sanwa's boots. Depth, 2,000 meters. Telemetry lost. Assets disconnected. The 2 green icons blinked out on her HUD. The digital map was empty save for the cold blue wireframe of the pillars and the jagged, broken edge of the bridge. Inside her helmet, Sanwa closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She filed the grief away into a sealed, compressed partition in her mind, locking it behind the cold, iron necessity of the mission. She was the commander. The board had been cleared. Sanwa opened her eyes and turned her featureless black visor toward Stephen, who was still staring in horror at the broken bridge. The local assets are neutralized, Sanwa stated through her external chest speaker, her synthesized voice identical flat, and chillingly devoid of emotion. Unit 4 and Unit 5 are designated MIA. We are down to 3 operatives and 1 guide. She raised her carbine, smoothly ejecting the spent thermal magazine and snapping a fresh one into place with a sharp click. She looked toward the massive, sealed blast doors at the far end of the platform, the blue waypoint marker pulsing steadily in her vision. The security trap confirms the asset is down here, Sanwa said, stepping past Stephen into the dark. Move, Sergeant, the next level awaits.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. I did realize in my previous video, I was monitoring the stream anyway, and I did realize that the volume was like crazy high on my voice. Yeah, that sounds perfect. So a light listenable volume. That sounds pretty cool. Alright. Oh, I hope you all enjoyed that. So that was chapters 1 through 5. I still need to write the remaining chapters, of course. But I got this weekend, and then back to work, of course, I go. And I'm excited to get the story finished. And I don't know where it's going to go, honestly. But hopefully it continues to be cool. And thanks for watching. Have a great night, everybody. Oh, let's do... Oh, I'm so tired, but just trying to think of something. 1 second. Oh yes, so what I'm gonna do after this actually is I'm gonna set up something called AirPlay Receiver for OBS, because OBS, the streaming software, is what I'm using on my computer with JAWS for Windows, and it's been really cool, easy to use. So I'm gonna get off this stream. If I can install the AirPlay, then I might be able to do like reaction videos, watching shorts, or some of these podcasts that I do like to watch anyways. So who knows, can get some maybe cool clips out of that. But other than that, what is it? 7:23 now, Friday, August 21st, 2026, and I hope you all have a great night, and we'll outroll you back with the intro music. Let's just see. This is how you do